Chapter 1. Echoes beneath the floorboards. Miss Jane Marple settled key into her favorite armchair at the back of the vicarage parlor, a steaming cup of tea balanced on the small side table beside her. The late afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the worn Persian rug. She peered idly at the photographs on the mantel's smiling parishioners, cricket matches, and children's pageants when Mrs. Lettice Harrington, Vicar's housekeeper, interrupted her reverie. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Harrington," began, her voice quivering with a mixture of excitement and concern. "There's news from Little Woodside. Mrs. Abigail Penrose insists you must come at once." Miss Marple raised a single, neatly plucked eyebrow. "My dear, Little Woodside, as always, it's been rather quiet. Prattle to me what happens there that warrants such urgency." Mrs. Harrington smoothed her starched apron. "It's her house, Miss Forkerside Cottage. She says there's a whisper beneath the floorboards. She heard it last night, faint, but unmistakable. She's certain it wasn't the wind or the settling timbers. It has her quite unsettled. Begs you to come and see for yourself." "A whisper beneath the floorboards," Miss Marple repeated, her tone gentle but curious. "That is indeed unusual. Pray tell, does she suspect any particular cause?" "I gathered she fears someone may be hiding in the crawl space, spying on her, perhaps. She's quite frail, you know. Lives alone since her husband passed 2 years ago. I dare say she's frightened beyond measure." Miss Marple rocked her teacup thoughtfully. "You shall convey my sympathies, and most certainly I shall go. Perhaps the explanation is more ordinary than she imagines. Still, I would not dismiss her concerns. A woman living alone can be more vulnerable to strange noises." By 4:30, Miss Marple was driving through the rolling hills toward Little Woodside, the familiar landscape turning from bright green hedgerows to the thatched cottages that clustered around a modest village green. The air carried the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. A light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. She recalled Mrs. Penrose's reputation: kind, reserved, but not given to flights of fancy. If she claimed to have heard whispers, there must be something to it. Forkerside Cottage came into view. A quaint weatherboard house with creeper-clad walls, its windows aglow with lamplight despite the early hour. A low wooden fence surrounded a modest garden where late summer blooms nodded beneath the evening sky. As Miss Marple drew up to the gate, she noted the neat path that led to the front door, in an air of neat orderliness about the property that suggested Mrs. Penrose prided herself on appearance. She was greeted at the doorstep by Mrs. Penrose, herself a petite woman in her 70s, her silver hair swept back into a tidy bun, her eyes bright but rimmed with worry. She wore a simple floral dress and a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped Miss Marple's in greeting. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for coming so quickly," she said, her voice wavering. "I wasn't sure what to do. I tried speaking to the vicar, but I felt I needed someone who understood these things." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "Nonsense, my dear. We'll investigate thoroughly. Let us begin with a cup of tea, and you can tell me everything." Inside, the parlor was cozy, with pale wallpaper decorated by subtle floral motifs, bookshelves filled with volumes of poetry and local history, and a crackling fire that lent warmth to the room. Mrs. Penrose nodded appreciatively as Miss Marple poured tea into delicate china cups, and she seated herself with a sigh. "I first heard the noise late last night," Mrs. Penrose explained, wrapping her hands around the teacup. "It sounded like soft murmurings, as if someone were speaking in hushed tones just beneath the floor. First, I thought it was my imagination, or perhaps the cat, though he's been out for the evening. But it became persistent. I even laid my ear to the floorboards in the hallway and heard it clearly. Whispers, gentle but urgent. I admit I felt my heart flutter." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And "Did you happen to notice any footsteps or see any sign of entry?" she asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Penrose shook her head. "No footsteps, no creaking of floorboards above. The windows and doors are locked. I checked them all before going to bed. There's no sign of anyone entering, no footprints in the garden, no disturbance to the flower beds." It's as if the voice came from under the very boards themselves. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Have you had any visitors recently? Anyone you might have fallen out with, or perhaps someone who might wish to frighten you?" Mrs. Penrose frowned. "Well, there was Mr. Thompson, the solicitor's clerk, who called a week ago to discuss my late husband's will. He suggested some confusion over a codicil, but he was polite and entirely respectful. Can't imagine him doing anything untoward." "And your dear husband, when he was alive, was he engaged in any disputes? Perhaps business matters that could have lingering resentments?" "She was a quiet man, gentle as any. He managed a village shop for years. No enemies that I knew of. Everyone thought highly of him. After his passing, I continued living here. I've had no trouble until now." Miss Marple rose and indicated the hallway beyond. "Very well. Let us examine the place where you heard the sound. Show me where it was loudest." Mrs. Penrose led her down a narrow corridor, the boards underfoot creaking faintly. He paused at a section in the hallway near a small drop in the floor where a loose board had been repaired. Miss Marple knelt and pressed her ear against the wood for a moment, closing her eyes. "There," said Mrs. Penrose, her voice trembling. "Right there." Miss Marple straightened and placed a gentle hand upon Mrs. Penrose's arm. "I heard something," she said quietly. "A faint murmur, indeed, but I cannot make out words. It sounds almost deliberate. May I look beneath?" Mrs. Penrose nodded and fetched a small screwdriver. Together they prized up the loose board, revealing a shallow crawl where the floor joist crossed a narrow cavity. A thin layer of dust lay undisturbed, save for a few small footprints or marks that appeared fresh. Miss Marple's keen eyes studied the imprints. "Notice how these marks form a path toward the far wall," Miss Marple pointed out. "And yet they stop abruptly here, as though someone scrambled away or hid more deeply. Whoever it was has taken care to remain unseen." Mrs. Penrose gasped softly. "My heavens! Do you think someone is hiding here even now?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I cannot say for certain, but I do believe someone has recently moved about beneath these boards. Those whispers are likely from a person, not some trick of acoustics. We must be cautious. Perhaps the vicar's husband can bring a lantern and assist. In the meantime, remain calm. I shall send for Inspector Craddock to investigate properly. But I am inclined to think there may be more here than meets the eye." As Miss Marple lowered the loose board gently back into place, she allowed her mind to wander through the possibilities. A clandestine lover, a clever thief, or even a desperate soul seeking refuge. The evening shadows lengthened in the hallway, and Miss Marple sensed that this humble cottage, with its whispering floorboards, concealed a secret that would soon reveal itself. Chapter 2. Shadows and Suspicions. The following morning dawned mist-laden and cool, as though little Woodside itself wished to keep its secrets cloaked. Miss Marple arrived at Forkerside Cottage shortly after 8, bearing a small leather satchel filled with her private notebook, a tape measure, and her reliable magnifying glass. The front garden glistened with dew, and a solitary blackbird flitted among the flower beds, its song muted by the early haze. Mrs. Penrose, standing on the doorstep in a simple cardigan and long skirt, greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I trust you managed to secure Inspector Craddock?" Mrs. Penrose asked, her voice hushed as though fearful of attracting unwelcome attention. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "Indeed, he's due any moment. Meanwhile, we shall take a closer look inside and ensure no detail escapes our notice." Inside the cottage, the parlor's warmth had faded overnight, leaving faint traces of ash in the fireplace. Miss Marple carefully replaced her teacup on the side table before stepping into the hallway. There, a battered stool allowed her to glance down at the section of floorboards she had prized up the previous evening. The faint outline of footprints stood out against the pale dust, delicate, almost childlike, yet deeply worn. She crouched to inspect them. Notice how the impressions are shallow, as though the person weighed less than an adult, Miss Marple remarked, tracing her finger gently along the curve of a print. Either a small framed individual or someone taking extreme care not to leave evidence of weight. Mrs. Penrose hovered nearby. My granddaughter, Lillian, visited last week, but she's no longer staying. Could it have been her? She always did like exploring dark corners. Miss Marple rose smoothly. Possible, but those visits ended days ago, okay? And she wouldn't remain hidden for long without fresh air or supplies. Besides, did Lillian appear troubled when she left? That she did not, Mrs. Penrose replied firmly. She left cheerfully. At precisely 8:15, a firm knock sounded on the front door. Miss Marple opened it to reveal Inspector Craddock, a tidy man in his late 40s, sporting a gray suit and bowler hat. His sharp eyes flicked toward the cottage's entrance. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted Miss Marple. "Mrs. Penrose told me I'd likely find you here. Have you already uncovered anything of note?" "I have some initial observations," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to admit him. "But I'm afraid an inspector with your experience she'll see them for himself. I suspect someone's been hiding in the crawlspace." Inspector Craddock removed his hat. "Very well, lead the way." All three moved down the narrow corridor to the hallway. The dim overhead beam cast elongated shadows against the walls, and the atmosphere felt charged. Miss Marple gestured toward the section of loose floorboard. "Here," she said softly. "The disturbed board reveals a shallow cavity where footsteps were found last night. Beside those footprints, I noticed a small piece of fabric caught on a nail." She lifted a length of thread-like cloth, roughly the size of a postage stamp, its edges frayed and stained. "Okay." The pattern was floral, printed in faded pinks and greens. Inspector Craddock took a gloved hand to examine it. "Looks like part of a dress or scarf," he observed. "Not the sort of thing a child might carry. Did you find this near the far wall of the cavity?" "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed. "It lay just beyond where the footprints ended. Whoever or whatever moved here must have brushed against that nail." Inspector Craddock made a note in his notebook. "We ought to search the entire crawl space thoroughly. Perhaps there are more clues deeper in." Miss Marple nodded and fetched a small oil lamp from a nearby shelf. She handed it to Craddock, who lit its wick and lowered himself into the cavity. The space was cramped. Wooden joists overhead creaked ominously as he maneuvered. Mrs. Penrose watched anxiously, wringing her hands. Within a minute, Inspector Craddock's calm voice echoed upward. "There's something hair a wooden box set into the floor's underside. It's fastened with a simple latch." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Penrose. A hidden compartment, perhaps. Someone went to great lengths to conceal it. Craddock re-emerged, wiping soot from his hands. He held a small, locked box, its surface scratched and stained, quite old and covered in dust. "Whoever placed it here hasn't returned. It's been undisturbed for some time, but it's clearly what the hiding person wheeled in. We must open it." Mrs. Penrose looked pale. "Pray be careful. Kellis, my late husband, always kept certain items secure. I haven't seen this box before." Inspector Craddock produced a thin metal tool and expertly picked the lock. The lid creaked open to reveal a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, along with a tarnished silver locket and a small leather-bound diary. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Letters, a locket, and a diary, quite the trove," she murmured. These may belong to someone with a strong attachment to Mrs. Penrose, or perhaps someone seeking revenge. Craddock lifted the diary, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was small and slanted, words penned in hurried strokes. This diary dates back at least a decade, he noted. See the date on the first entry. Miss Marple leaned in. It's marked June 1915, written by one Abigail Smythe. That's not our Mrs. Penrose, though. Mrs. Penrose's brow furrowed. Abigail Smythe. I don't recognize that name. Who could she be? Miss Marple flipped to the second page. Here a note to a P on our wedding day, May 1916. I promise to love you forever. From ASAP, must be our Penrose. Mrs. Penrose's lips trembled. My name was Abigail Penrose, after my marriage Penrose, niece Smythe. These are my letters. My grandfather wrote them. My dear husband had these kept secret. I thought them lost in a fire at Barrow Hall. She sank into a nearby chair. I remember now. My grandfather refused to let the world see his letters to me when I married John. He insisted I keep those pages locked away. I never knew where he placed them. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. So the box contains family heirlooms, but why was it hidden under the floor? And why would someone crawl beneath the boards to retrieve it now? Inspector Craddock pocketed the little diary. That is the question. Achaia, it appears your grandfather's box has remained concealed for years, Mrs. Penrose. Someone knew of its location recently. Possibly a relative, long thought absent. Or someone hoping to gain leverage. Mrs. Penrose covered her mouth. It's my cousin, Martin Penrose. He lives in Bath. He had always coveted our family property. Could he have come here in secret? Miss Marple folded her hands. It's plausible. We must consider who knew of the box's existence and its hiding place. Meanwhile, the whisper you heard may have been from the person seeking these items. Let us keep this under wraps until we consult with Inspector Craddock further. As Mrs. Penrose dabbed at her eyes, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the concealed compartment. The gentle light of the oil lamp threw dancing shadows onto the walls, hinting that Granny's hidden secrets were only the beginning. Someone had risked detection to recover these relics, and the next step would likely involve that person making a move soon. In the hush of the cottage, a new tension settled a hush as insistent as the whisper beneath the floorboards. Chapter 3. A Visitor in the Rain by Late Afternoon. A steady drizzle had settled over Little Woodside, cloaking the hedgerows and thatched roofs in silvery mist. Miss Marple stood near the parlor window of Forkaside Cottage, her knitting basket in her lap, though her hands remained idle. The gentle tapping of raindrops against the glass provided a quiet counterpoint to her thoughts. The discovery of her diary, the sudden appearance of a hidden compartment, and the question now hovering, who knew of its existence? Mrs. Penrose hovered nearby, flitting from window to window, anxiously awaiting any arrival. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Miss Marple rose and opened it to reveal a tall, unshaven man in a dark overcoat. His hair damp and eyes darting about as though seeking confirmation that this was indeed Forkaside Cottage. He carried a battered leather satchel, similar to the one Miss Marple had brought earlier. Cousin Martin, I presumed? Mrs. Penrose asked breathlessly, stepping forward with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. You said you were returning in a fortnight, but Martin Penrose offered a half smile. Circumstances compelled me to come sooner, Abigail. I've been meaning to visit, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. His gaze flickered toward Miss Marple. Miss Marple, I trust you are taking good care of dear Aunt. Miss Marple inclined her head. Good afternoon, Mr. Penrose. We've inspected some curious occurrences. Hear whispers beneath the floorboards and a hidden family box. I understand from Mrs. Penrose that you might wish to see it. Martin's brow creased. Indeed. I heard from my solicitor that there might be some confusion about family papers and artifacts. Perhaps I could look at whatever you found." He cast a fleeting glance at the parlor window and then entered, as though brushing aside the rain. From his overcoat, inside, Miss Marple guided him gently toward the hallway, where the section of loose floorboards still bore faint traces of that morning's discovery. Mrs. Penrose followed, clutching her shawl as though it offered comfort. Inspector Craddock, summoned by Miss Marple, stood behind them, his notebook at the ready. Martin peered down at the board. "Ah, yes, the very place," he said, carefully crouching to turn up the same board. I recall grandfather once mentioned a hiding spot here, though I never paid much attention as a boy." He frowned at the empty cavity. "But the box is gone." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "Your cousin retrieved a box earlier today, if you recall." He held up the tarnished diary and locket. "These items belonged to Mrs. Penrose." Teen nodded. Yes. I received word that she had recovered them, but they've been in the family for generations. Some letters in here mention a codicil to the will, something I ought to see." He flipped through the diary's first few pages, eyes sweeping over the cramped handwriting. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "These letters date back to World War the First, very private matters. Perhaps that codicil determined inheritance." She paused, then added, "We must be cautious. Someone has access to this cottage without invitation." Martin's expression flickered an almost imperceptible flash of guilt before he masked it with a polite smile. "Whoever it was must be found. I assure you, Abigail, I would never sneak around here in the dark." Mrs. Penrose seemed uncertain, glancing between her cousin and Miss Marple. I don't know anyone else who knew the hiding place," she murmured. "It must be someone clever." Craddock beckoned him into the parlor, where he set the diary on a small writing desk. "Mr. Penrose, did you perhaps witness anyone suspicious? Neighbors, passersby?" His tone was politely probing. Martin's gaze hardened slightly. "I've no idea," Martin replied. "I arrived late last night and stayed at the inn. I did not come here until now. I did, however, receive a telegram early this morning saying, 'I know where the box is. Meet me at Foxglove Barn at noon if you wish to keep it.' I ignored it as nonsense. The box must have been taken from here earlier, not by me. A mess." Marple tapped her knitting needles together. "Foxglove Barn is a good distance from here, a mile northwest of Little Woodside. I imagine the sender thought to lure someone to a rendezvous." "Did you respond?" Martin frowned. "No, I destroyed the telegram. I thought it some trick to unsettle me." He smiled at Mrs. Penrose. "Your letters are quite amusing, both witty and romantic. I hadn't realized how doting grandfather was." Mrs. Penrose shivered. "That era was different, but I had thought those letters lost in the fire at Barrow Hall." She glanced warily at Martin's notebook. "Why would someone want to recover such personal items?" Miss Marple interjected gently. "Sentimental value alone isn't always enough motivation. There may be something written here, a secret perhaps, that could influence present-day situations." She ran a slender finger along the edge of a page. "This entry from November 1916 mentions a safe deposit at Greystone Bank. It's marked with a code. Could that contain evidence of a separate inheritance?" Inspector Craddock scribbled furiously. "Greystone Bank safe deposit worth investigating. If someone learned of that code, they could extract something of value." Martin's face tightened. "Greystone Bank closed years ago. Sets moved. But it's possible old documents still lie in an unclaimed vault." He tapped his fingers impatiently. "If there's money or deeds hidden, that would explain someone's interest." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. I propose we visit Greystone Bank tomorrow morning. But tonight, we must discover who sent that telegram. The courier likely passed through Little Woodside. Perhaps the innkeeper saw someone. Mrs. Penrose looked anxious. Good heavens, an as yet unidentified person, tracking family secrets. She turned to Martin. Do you think it was you they intended to lure? Or maybe someone else eager for those letters? Martin shrugged, turning indifference into a shield. I don't know. It may have been addressed to you, Abigail, given your name is signed on many of these letters. He cleared his throat. But enough speculation. I think I should retire to the guest room. It's been a long trip. Miss Marple's gaze lingered. Of course, Kay. But do come down for dinner at 8. We have much to discuss. As Martin ascended the stairs, Craddock approached Miss Marple in a low voice. That cousin seems nervous, Craddock whispered. Do you think he's honest? Miss Marple followed Martin's retreating figure as he disappeared around the corner. I'm not sure. The story about the telegram seems plausible yet. Who among us could place a second set of eyes on that advertisement? Okay. And notice how he spoke of the bank's code so readily. Perhaps too readily. Craddock nodded. We'll need to interview the innkeeper and retrieve any records sent last night. The soft glow of the parlors. Lamplight threw long shadows against the walls as Mrs. Penrose joined them, clutching her shawl. I fear what else may be hidden here, she said, voice trembling. Please, Miss Marple, uncover the truth before it's too late. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. Patience, my dear. We shall follow every thread until this tapestry reveals its pattern. Kay. She set down her knitting and regarded the diary on the desk. For now, let us prepare for the evening. Kay. As rain tapped the roof and dusk settled into darkness, the cottage felt both sanctuary and snare. Somewhere in the night air, footsteps drifted silent warnings of secrets yet to be unearthed, and of a visitor as yet unseen, watching from beyond the door. Chapter 4. Whispers in the dead of night that evening. Forkerside Cottage felt hushed, the wind howling faintly outside, while rain-slicked branches tapped against the leaded windows. Mrs. Penrose had set the parlor table for dinner with an old lace cloth and polished silverware. The low lamplight created a gentle warmth, though outside the sky had turned a slate gray. Miss Marple sat beside Mrs. Penrose at the small, round table. Inspector Craddock and Martin Penrose occupied the 2 chairs facing them. A simple meal of roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, and steamed vegetables was laid out, and the faint aroma of fresh bread lingered in the air. Martin lifted his fork, hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat. Abigail, I trust your health is improving since yesterday's ordeal. Mrs. Penrose managed a small smile. Thank you, Martin. I feel better, though the entire affair shaken me badly. Having you here offers some comfort if only because you might help clarify what's happening. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Indeed. We were discussing plans for tomorrow, visiting Greystone Bank to verify any safe deposit connected to these letters. Inspector Craddock will accompany us to see if any record remains. Craddock nodded. Greystone Bank's local branch closed long ago, but the main vault in Norbury might still hold archives. It's a half-day trip at least. Martin exchanged a glance with his cousin. I can arrange horses for the journey, if you wish. My carriage awaits at the end. He offered a polite smile at Miss Marple. You're welcome to travel in my company. Miss Marple inclined her head. Cue Mr. Penrose. That would be most helpful. But first, we must learn who sent that telegram. Craddock, you mentioned inquiring at the inn. Tomorrow, at first light, Craddock confirmed. However, I have a feeling we should be on our guard tonight. Someone clearly knows these family secrets. They may act again before morning. Martin frowned, pressing a crust of bread to his plate. Are you suggesting an intruder might return tonight? Perhaps to reclaim the box? I am, Miss Marple replied quietly. The telegram hinted at a meeting at Foxglove Barn at noon. If the sender truly wished to unsettle us, they might lurk nearby, watching for any mishap. Mrs. Penrose's eyes widened. Good heavens, could they come in through a window? I locked everything before retiring. Miss Marple took a small notebook from her pocket and jotted a few notes. We must assume no place is impervious. I suggest we retire early, keep lights dim, and remain vigilant. I'll place a candle by the doorway in case of any disturbance. Craddock slid his chair back. I'll check the locks again before nightfall. I'll also position myself near the front entrance, ready to call for assistance if needed. Martin rose and adjusted his coat. I shall secure the back door. I never liked how the latch sticks sometimes. It could allow someone to slip out or in unnoticed. Mrs. Penrose looked between them with gratitude. Thank you, both of you. I don't know what I'd do alone. After dinner, they cleared the table together. The kettle hissed gently as Mrs. Penrose boiled fresh water for tea. Outside, the rain intensified, pattering against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Craddock methodically inspected each lock and bolt on the front door, checking the windows for any sign of tampering. Martin tested the latch on the back door, greasing it with a bit of oil to ensure it closed tightly. Once the cottage was secured, they gathered in the parlor by the fire. Martin offered to bring his hunting coat inside, draping it over a chair. Craddock settled in an armchair with Miss Marple perched on the edge of the sofa and Mrs. Penrose in her usual favorite chair. The fire crackled as they talked quietly, the only sound beyond their voices and the whispering wind outside. Miss Marple folded her hands. Let us review what we know. Someone knew of the hidden compartment and retrieved the diary, letters, and locket. They then sent a threatening telegram, likely to lure a family member to Foxglove Barn. That meeting never occurred. Instead, the items remained here. Now, there may be someone lurking nearby, hoping for an opportunity. Craddock glanced at Martin. Akia, your journey from Bath to Little Woodside, did you send any credible messages about when you'd arrive? Who else knew your plans? Martin frowned, sipping his tea. My solicitor, Mr. Thompson, who transferred the diary's legal oversight to me. He urged me to claim those documents as proof of inheritance. I didn't inform anyone else. But yes, I told the innkeeper I'd return late last night. Beyond that, no one knew the precise time. Miss Marple nodded. Then someone could have written the telegram based on your anticipated arrival. That implies they know you plan to come here. Who outside the family would be aware? Mrs. Penrose shivered. Mr. Thompson himself he's handled many estates, but I trust him. He seems honest. Connie looked unconvinced. Connie solicitors can be compelled to reveal information, though I doubt Mr. Thompson would do so without reason. But these letters mention a codicil that might leave a portion of family property to someone else, maybe a distant cousin. Miss Marple allowed a soft smile that could ignite greed. But for now, we must remain watchful. Let us retire early and sleep lightly, sharing the guest room so we can better guard against intruders. Martin cleared his throat. I will sleep in the inn. I don't wish to trap anyone in here. Let me know if you need me tonight. Mrs. Penrose protested gently. I would feel safer with you here, Martin. Martin shook his head. My place is at the inn. I'll keep watch from a distance and return if needed. He collected his coat, kissed his hand to his cousin, and departed into the rain, leaving the cottage door closed behind him. Miss Marple rose to stand by the window. High fell in sheets, but she could just make out the silhouette of Foxglove Barn to the northwest, its old timber beams creaking in the wind. I wonder if the sender watches that barn now, waiting for someone foolish enough to come. Craddock revved a low chuckle. If so, they'll be disappointed to come morning when no one ventures out. Shall we extinguish this lamp and try to sleep? Mrs. Penrose clutched her shawl around her shoulders. I'm not sure I'll sleep a wink. Miss Marple patted her hand. Perhaps a cup of warm milk and a story will settle your nerves. She leaned toward the sideboard, pouring milk into 2 cups. The warmth seemed to soothe her trembling cousin. Afterward, they snuffed the lamp, leaving only the firelight dancing across patterned wallpaper and dark wood furniture. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock shared the spare bedroom, while Mrs. Penrose remained by the fire until exhaustion overtook her. Miss Marple placed a small candle on the bedside table, leaving it lit as a precaution. Craddock arranged a chair against the door, ensuring it could not be forced open easily. Night deepened, and the wind outside grew fierce. The trail of rain pounded on the roof like a drum. In the stillness, Miss Marple's mind wandered through every conversation, every clue juxtaposed against the howl of the storm. She recalled the pattern of footprints, the torn cloth, the missing letters, and Martin's unclear motives. The diary's code for Greystone Bank lay under her pillow, and she resolved to investigate it at dawn. Around midnight, Miss Marple stirred, awakened by the faintest creak from the hallway. She sat upright, listened with serene concentration. A soft footstep, nearly inaudible beneath the wind's roar, drifted across the corridor. Craddock, eyes closed but alert, remained silent. The footstep paused by Mrs. Penrose's bedroom door, and a faint rustle echoed a cloth brushing against wood. Miss Marple held her breath. The intruder must have found a way into the hallway. She leaned toward Craddock and whispered, "Someone is here." Craddock's rigid form sprang to attention. It grasped his revolver from the bedside. He moved toward the door, hearts in their throats. The candle's flame flickered as they reached the threshold. The hallway lay empty. The rain lashed the windows, and the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Yet Miss Marple noticed a single droplet of water on the floor. Just beyond Mrs. Penrose's door, a wet footprint. She whispered to Craddock. Someone entered recently, perhaps from the back door. Craddock closed the distance to the front door, poised to examine the lock. He ran a gloved finger along the catch. Locked, unremarkable. The intruder must have left through the back. Miss Marple slipped into Mrs. Penrose's room. The bed was empty. The window curtains fluttered from a slight draft. A faint impression in the carpet led toward the back corridor. They followed it, discovering the back door's latch untouched, but the threshold's stones damp, indicating someone had stepped over just moments before. Miss Marple knelt to inspect the faint tracks, small-footed, just as the footprints beneath the floorboards. The same person, perhaps. She rose, heading to the parlor door. Let us wait for dawn to find this visitor. No use rushing into the storm. Kay returned to the bedroom, bolting the door behind them. Craddock held Miss Marple's gaze. We'll keep watch until sunrise. Miss Marple's eyes shone. Indeed, the night's whispers may be quiet, but daylight will reveal all. Outside, the storm raged on, as if nature itself conspired to echo the silent mysteries within Forecastle Cottage. Chapter 5. The Stolen Secrets by Dawn. The storm had abated, leaving a hush over Little Woodside, punctuated only by occasional birdsong and the drip of rainwater from eaves. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock sat vigilantly in the spare bedroom, their eyes fixed on the narrow corridor's door. Outside, the first pale rays of morning filtered through fog, revealing flattened hedgerows and glistening cobblestones. Both had dozed fitfully, each alert to the faintest creak or murmur. But as the gray light deepened, they sensed that no further intruder would challenge the cottage that night. Miss Marple stretched and lowered the candle's flame, extinguishing it with a small sigh. Perhaps we may take a moment's rest, she whispered. Craddock nodded, easing into the chair by the door. Miss Marple turned toward her bed. She noticed something amiss. The diary tucked beneath her pillow. Previous evening was gone. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Craddock, she murmured, voice taut. I placed the diary under my pillow. It has vanished. Inspector Craddock bolted upright, eyes widening. You certain? It must be here. Someone cannot have taken it without our noticing. Miss Marple knelt, lifting the pillow. The crisp page edges and elegant handwriting of Abigail Smythe's diary should have been visible, but there was only the indentation of where it once lay. "Someone came into this room," she said quietly, and removed it. "Look, see how the cover material left this faint mark." She ran a fingertip across the dresser, discovering a smudge of dark mud or footprints remnant. They crossed here, then vanished. Craddock grabbed his pocket lantern and surveyed the hardwood floor. A single muddy footprint, smaller than his gloved hand, showed an arch and narrow heel. He crouched to inspect it. Shallow, like it passed lightly. Possibly the same intruder we heard in the corridor. He rose. "We must find where they exited." Miss Marple slipped from the room. Craddock close behind. At the threshold of the hallway, its faint dampness of footprints led toward the back of the cottage. Mrs. Penrose, roused by their voices, emerged bleary-eyed from her sitting room, clutching her shawl. "What is it? Did someone take something else?" Miss Marple crouched by the last footprint. "Yes, my dear. Someone entered here last night, stealthily perhaps, searching every room. They stole the diary under my pillow." She looked up, meeting Mrs. Penrose's wide, fearful eyes. "They may know of its value. We must follow these tracks." Craddock motioned toward the back door. "Madam, please remain here. You need rest. We'll examine the backyard." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Mrs. Penrose's arm. "Do not worry. We shall recover it." Outside, the dawn air was crisp, and the garden's blooms hung heavy with raindrops. The back door, though locked, had a slight smudge of dampness on its threshold where someone had stepped. Beyond lay the narrow gravel path to the vegetable plot. Craddock and Miss Marple crouched to follow a barely visible trail of muddy footprints leading away from the cottage toward the rear hedgerow. "See how they head northwest," Miss Marple observed, her brow furrowed. "Foxglove Barn lies in that direction about a mile away. If our intruder knew that place was once mentioned as a rendezvous, they might have sought refuge there." Craddock nodded. "We should alert the sergeant at the station to block the lane near the barn. But first, let's confirm if anyone remains in the garden." He shone the lantern downward. Beneath a drooping rosebush lay a small scrap of paper, damp and crumpled. He picked it up gingerly. "Seems torn from something a map, perhaps." Unfolding it revealed jagged edges and half a penciled word. "Stone." Underneath, a rough sketch of a building outline in the letters FOX lingered. Miss Marple traced a fingertip along the sketch. "Fox," she whispered. "It reads Fox Stone. Could be Foxglove Barn or Foxstone House. In any case, it points northwest." She folded the scrap and pocketed it. "We must hurry. The diary lies within reach of our intruder. He may be looking now for a hiding spot." They followed the faint footprints down the garden path until it faded at the hedgerow. Beyond, the land tilted toward marshy ground that Sherwood Brook skirted. Crossed carefully, Craddock's boots squelching in mud. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught two more footprints near the brook's edge, one partially filled with water. "He paused here," she murmured, perhaps marking his course. Craddock examined the ground. Then he climbed the bank on the other side. "We'll have to traverse wet meadows toward Foxglove Barn. We must be swift. He's already had hours to hide." Miss Marple nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Lead on, Inspector." They set off across the soggy field, the scrap of paper guiding their path. The early sun struggled through gray clouds, casting a pale light over the dew-slick grass. Behind them, the cottage's chimneys released tendrils of smoke, a reassuring sign that all was not lost. After 10 minutes of trudging through mud and brambles, they gained a footpath alongside a low stone wall. Across the meadow, a weathered oak tree marked the path toward Foxglove Barn. The structure's silhouette, sagging roof, and broken windowpane could just be discerned through the mist. As they approached the barn, Craddock raised a finger to his lips. "I see no one outside. We must enter carefully." The barn's double doors hung partially ajar, rusted hinges groaning in the breeze. They slipped inside to find a dank space strewn with hay, rotting sacks, and a ladder leaning against the far wall. The air smelled of damp straw and mildew. Miss Marple scanned the floor. Footprints led to a small stall corner, where a battered wooden crate lay concealed behind torn burlap. She knelt and blew away dust to reveal the same floral pattern as the scrap of cloth they'd found beneath Forker's side. He discarded part of a letter. "This cloth came from the diary's cover," she remarked. "The diary may be inside that crate." Craddock pried the crate open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the diary and letters, their paper damp but intact. Miss Marple carefully lifted them, relief softening her expression. Yet, scattered around were other scraps of paper maps, torn bits of family trees, and penciled names. "He was looking for more than just the diary," she said quietly. "Perhaps other documents showing inheritance rights." Craddock tucked the diary into his coat. "We'll return these immediately." But what of the intruder? A faint rustle sounded from the loft overhead. Both froze. Miss Marple peered upward at the darkness above. "He's there. Stay close." Craddock drew his revolver as a figure descended the ladder, wet and trembling, eyes wide with fear. In a sudden voice, the stranger stammered, "People, don't shoot. I just wanted proof that I'm a rightful heir." Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Who are you?" she asked in a calm tone. The man's features came into focus, a young, thin fellow with sunken cheeks and poignant eyes. "My name is Edward Smeeth, Vebale's cousin's son. I heard rumors of family papers kept here and believed the diary would prove my claim. I meant no harm." Craddock lowered his weapon, watching the intruder warily. "You could have asked for a meeting instead of sneaking in." Edward's shoulders slumped. "I was afraid no one would hear me. My mother died before revealing the codicil's details. I found the torn map at the cottage and followed it here." He nodded toward the scattered scraps. Miss Marple regarded him with empathy. "You sought justice for your mother's line, but secrecy nearly got you in a grave predicament." She folded the diary into a protective cloth. "Come with us. We'll ensure your claim is fairly heard." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the barn in golden light. Edward followed Miss Marple and Craddock down the path, clutching the recovered diary. For a moment, the mystery poised between right and wrong settled into a fragile resolution, though. Only time would reveal the true measure of family loyalty and rightful inheritance. "There, the matter is now resolved legally." Inspector Craddock smiled. "It seems justice has been served. Congratulations. But let us ensure the deeds transfer correctly. Mr. Hargreaves, please assist us with any formal paperwork." Hargreaves bowed. He copied the ledger's entry into his official record book, then produced a pair of formal documents, one transferring a quarter interest in Meadows End Farm to Edward, and another affirming Martin's role as executor of the remaining estate. Edward signed with a steady hand, his brow furrowed but confident. "I vow to honor my grandmother's wishes and to hold the farm in trust until, should circumstances change, the remainder of the codicil's beneficiaries come forward." Mrs. Penrose exhaled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Ain't proud of you, Edward. You have upheld our family's honor." Martin extended his hand to Edward. "Well done, cousin. I know now why you risked so much. Let us return to Little Woodside, where we can celebrate and discuss the future of Meadows End." They filed out of the vault and locked a heavy door behind them. Miss Marple lingered, glancing at the vault manager. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Hargreaves. Your care of these documents has been exemplary." He inclined his head. "Hey, it is my duty. Should you require anything further, do not hesitate to return." The carriage ride back to Little Woodside felt lighter, as though the air itself had released its tension. Edward sat beside his cousin, and they spoke quietly of plans for the farm. Mrs. Penrose dozed, gratitude softening her features after the turmoil of the previous days. Miss Marple slipped into thought, considering what remained unresolved: the intruder in Forkside Cottage, the torn scraps discovered at Foxglove Barn beyond the diary, and the possibility that someone else still coveted hidden documents. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat as they neared the village. "We should visit Foxglove Barn with Martin and Edward this afternoon to recover any remaining evidence. It may reveal who else sought to codicil someone perhaps less honorable than our young cousin." He glanced toward Miss Marple. "Are you amenable to such a plan?" Miss Marple allowed a small smile. "Very much so. I believe we have not seen the last of this family's secrets, but for now, a shared sense of peace has returned to Little Woodside. We can take time to gather our wits before seeking further truth." They arrived at Forkside Cottage by late afternoon. The thatched roof gleamed with fresh sunlight, and the village children played in the lane, their laughter drifting like birdsong. At the doorstep, Mrs. Penrose roused herself and descended the carriage steps, her shawl draped carefully as she welcomed her cousins with relief. Inside the parlor, she placed the deeds and codicil on the mantel for safekeeping, while Miss Marple brought tea and cakes to the center table. Martin gestured to the recovered diary. "We have tomorrow to consider what to do with Meadows End Farm. Edward, the farm is under your stewardship, but I trust you will seek the best path forward." Edward met Martin's gaze. "I intend to lease it to Mr. Hobbs, the neighboring tenant, until I find my own way. Perhaps one day, with your guidance, I may return to manage it personally." Martin nodded. "Very wise. I shall help you with the legalities, but for tonight, let us drink tea in celebration of family unity." As they settled around the table, laughter and conversation flowing, Miss Marple studied each face, the joy on Edward's, hidden in Mrs. Penrose's eyes, the tentative pride on Martin's countenance. Yet, beyond the walls of the cottage, Foxglove Barn awaited, holding whispers of another intruder's motives, someone who might have manipulated torn scraps into a false trail, or perhaps hoped to seize the codicil for more selfish ends. Marple resolved she would investigate that mystery soon, but for now, she allowed a soft smile to warm her features. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and dusk settled into the horizon. In the quiet of that moment, the cottage felt blessed by resolution and hope. Tomorrow, they would seek the final pieces of this long-hidden puzzle. But tonight, family bonds held fast as hearts rejoiced, and the whisper beneath the floorboards at last receded into the quiet hum of newfound peace. Chapter 6. The journey to Norbury. Morning sunlight filtered through the parlor windows at Forkside Cottage, revealing the gentle dust motes dancing in the air. The previous day's excitement had settled into a quiet urgency as Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, Mrs. Penrose, Martin Penrose, and Edward Smith gathered over a late breakfast. The restored diary lay on the table, its oilcloth wrapping removed, the pages now carefully inspected and flagged with tiny ribbons. Outside, the thatched roof shed lingering drops of dew onto the gravel path. Despite the calm, each person felt the weight of what lay ahead: a journey to Norbury to investigate the safe deposit box at Greystone Bank and determine the true heir of the Penrose estate. Miss Marple seated herself in her usual armchair, tea in hand, as everyone took their places. "Thank you all for coming together so promptly," she began, her voice measured but warm. "We must examine the entries in Abigail Smythe's diary concerning what was placed in the safe at Greystone Bank. From there, we may discern why Edward felt justified and why Martin is concerned. Mrs. Penrose, would you read to us the relevant passages from last year's May and June entries?" Mrs. Penrose raised the diary gently. "Certainly, Miss Marple." She opened to a page dated May 12th, 1916. My sweet Abigail, on this day, I ensure your legacy is secure. At Greystone Bank in Norbury, I have deposited the deeds to Meadows End Farm. The silver locket engraved with our initials and the list of securities. Should anything befall me, you hold the key to that deposit. Mrs. Penrose paused, fingers trembling slightly. The next entry, June 4th, 1916, reads, I fear I am running out of time. I have included a codicil to leave 1/4 of our family fortune to our daughter's children, if such are to be. Should you ever find yourself without heirs of your own, the funds pass down to the Smythe line. I trust only Abigail to uphold my instructions. Inspector Craddock interjected, that codicil is key. It names heirs in the Smythe line if Abigail has no direct descendants. Edward, as your mother was Abigail's niece and had no children, you may indeed have a claim. Edward nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the moment. Martin's jaw tightened, though he masked his feelings with a polite nod. I see. But I had thought the will left all to Abigail directly, without mention of the Smythe cousins. Miss Marple tapped the table lightly. Your grandfather's original will may differ from this codicil. We must verify the exact legal wording. It seems your grandfather intended a contingency for his daughter's line, namely, Abigail's bloodline should Abigail produce no children. Edward qualifies under that description, assuming no undisclosed branch exists. She looked at Mrs. Penrose. Did you ever have children, dear? Mrs. Penrose shook her head. Oh no, I never married again. I thought those pages lost forever. I did not know of the codicil. I was told by my grandfather the safe deposit held only sentimental letters and a locket. I never suspected any large inheritance or farm deeds. Martin cleared his throat and looked at Edward. Yet Edward believed otherwise. No one told him. He must have learned of the code from some family matter. He turned to Miss Marple. I admit, I feel uneasy. I came to reclaim what I believed was rightfully mine, yet perhaps I was mistaken. Craddock closed his notebook. This is precisely why we must go to Norbury. Greystone Bank's archives will show the contents of that safe deposit box and the exact instructions. We'll also speak with bank officials to confirm the codicil's validity. He took a measured breath. Quite. There is still one complication. The safe deposit box may require a signed affidavit from Abigail Penrose or her direct legal representative to access. Mrs. Penrose, as the named beneficiary, you must accompany us. Mrs. Penrose nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. She placed her hand on Edward's shoulder. Edward, perhaps your mother told you something. If you can present a document proving your grandmother's instruction, that might suffice. If not, I can speak for myself as the direct descendant. Miss Marple gave a small smile. We can sort these details once we reach the bank. Now, let us prepare for the journey. It will take half a day by carriage, given the state of the roads. After the storm. Martin, will your carriage be ready? Martin stood. Yes, the horses have been fed and rested. I will bring the carriage round in an hour. Inspector Craddock, might you accompany me to Foxglove Barn on our return? There may be more evidence in that location. Edmund's intruder left torn scraps. Beyond the diary? Craddock nodded. Certainly, but first we secured the codicil at Norbury. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her handbag. Very well. I shall join the carriage at once, along with Mrs. Penrose and Edward. Let us depart promptly and return with clarity. She rose graciously, and the others followed her to the yard, where a handsome black carriage waited, its polished panels reflecting the morning sun. The driver, a sturdy young man named Tobias, stood by, reins in hand. As they settled onto the leather seats, Martin took up the reins. The coach jolted into motion, wheels crunching over the gravel and turning onto the lane. The villages, cottages, receded behind him, and the bridleway led them through hedgerows where the sun glimmered through fresh green leaves. His conversation was subdued, each person absorbed in thoughts of the bank vault ahead. Edward, pale but determined, gripped the diary in his lap. The road twisted through fields, past a lone windmill whose sails turned lazily in the breeze. At midday, they paused at a small wayside inn for a brief luncheon of beef pie and fresh bread. Mrs. Penrose's nerves fluttered as she scanned the road outside, looking for sign of any who might be watching. Miss Marple offered calm reassurance. "Mr. Penrose ensures our safety. Focus on the matter at hand. The diary will reveal the path forward." After their meal, they resumed the journey. The final stretch to Norbury ran alongside a narrow canal, whose placid water reflected the fluffy clouds above. A duck bobbed in the shallows, oblivious to the human concerns unfolding nearby. Edward peered at the horizon as they approached the town's outskirts. Tall brick buildings giving way to the grand edifice of Greystone Bank. Its facade, carved from pale limestone, stood majestic against a backdrop of flower-lined benches and ancient oaks. The carriage swept around a circular drive, depositing them before the imposing entrance. Two uniformed doormen stood at attention. As Mrs. Penrose emerged, Martin touched her arm. "Stay close to us. Should anything seem amiss, call upon Inspector Craddock." Craddock nodded and strode ahead, his police badge prominently displayed. They entered the grand lobby, whose marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. A carpeted corridor led them to an office door bearing a brass plaque. "Mr. Quentin Hargreaves, Senior Vault Manager." Inside, a cultivated man with silver hair and pince-nez spectacles rose to greet them. "Ah, Mrs. Penrose, Inspector Craddock, how can I assist you today?" He extended his hand. "And you must be Mr. Penrose and acquaintances." Miss Marple stepped forward pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves. We understand there is a safe deposit box belonging to Abigail Smythe Penrose and her late father, Edmund Smythe. We seek its contents and any legal instruction it contains." She handed the diary to Hargreaves. "This served as a key to our quest, but the official record here will confirm the codicil details." Hargreaves glanced at the diary. "Remarkable. I recall receiving a small packet from two distinguished lawyers many years ago, labeled Penrose Smythe inheritance documents. The code they referenced matched a cipher only known to the Smythe family. Please follow me." He led them down a hallway lined with polished wood panels to a reinforced vault door. A heavy, cylindrical lock clicked open under his skilled hands, and a guard stood by his side. Inside the vault, rows of steel cubbies stood behind the open door. Hargreaves retrieved a key from his pocket, inserted it into a lock marked with the number 27C. With a hiss, the door swung open to reveal a leather-bound ledger, several sealed envelopes, and a small wooden box of aged cedar. He placed the ledger on the counter, then handed the envelopes to Mrs. Penrose. "These letters are addressed to Miss Abigail Smythe Penrose. The ledger entry above confirms the date June 1916 and the codicil's terms. The box contains the deeds to Meadows End Farm." Mrs. Penrose's hands trembled as she unfolded the ledger. "Do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to my daughter, save for 1/4 to be held in reserve for her siblings and their heirs should she produce no issue." She read aloud, voice cracking slightly. It goes on to specify, "In the absence of lawful children, that quarter shall pass to the nearest blood relative of the Smythe line, as determined by Seniorita, specifically Edward Smythe of Little Woodside." She raised her eyes to Edward, whose face glowed with both relief and sorrow. Edward stepped forward to accept the sealed envelopes. "Thank you, Mrs. Penrose. I apologize for the deception. I was afraid I would never be believed." He opened one envelope, revealing a crisp sheet of paper outlining instructions to deliver the deeds to Martin should Abigail's line fail. My mother left this in my care. She asked me to seek the truth at any cost. Martin cleared his throat, folding his arms. So, Edward, you are, by the letter of the codicil, an heir to 1/4 of the estate, including the farm. He turned to Miss Marple. What of the remaining 3/4? Miss Marple nodded gently. Those belong to Abigail, and so, to you, Martin, as her named executor. There is no conflict. The matter with due diligence. In the meantime, perhaps we can reflect on how grandfather's foresight in drafting that codicil prevented a far greater injustice. She offered Mrs. Penrose a gentle smile. The farm, the locket, and the letters now stand safe in Edward's keeping, as our grandfather intended. Mrs. Penrose clasped Edward's hand. Yes, my dear, I shall never forget how you risked so much to uphold your mother's memory. You honor our family. She turned to Miss Marple. And you, thank you, dear friend. Without your insight, I might have wasted another decade believing the codicil lost forever. Miss Marple tipped her head gracefully. My pleasure, entirely. Though, I confess, the puzzle kept me quite entertained. She allowed herself a small, wry chuckle. Now, one final matter. Once Mr. Thompson is in custody, we must address the legal transition of Meadows End Farm. But for today, let us rest. Edward gave a relieved sigh. I shall write to Mr. Hobbs and arrange for the farm's upkeep. Knowing that peace has returned to our family is a balm to the soul. He turned to Martin. Cousin, I hope you can forgive me for the confusion my secrecy caused. Martin's expression softened. Nonsense, Edward. Now that we know the truth, a portion of our grandfather's estate safely belongs to you. I bear you no ill will. Let us move forward as family. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the western fields, Miss Marple walked with Mrs. Penrose through the vicarage garden. The air tasted of lavender and freshly mown grass. Mrs. Penrose paused by a rosebush, plucking a single bloom. She inhaled its fragrance deeply. There is a quiet I have not felt in so long, dear Miss Marple. The echoes beneath the floorboards, the whispers in the night, they have at last been banished. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Truth, once unearthed, has a way of dispelling darkness. Your grandfather's path was wise, and though Mr. Thompson's betrayal was grievous, it has taught us vigilance and the value of friendship. She gazed toward the cottage where the others had gathered for tea. From its windows emanated laughter and warm light. As for Foxglove Barn, Miss Marple continued, I suspect it will remain abandoned for some time. The barn's secrets outlived the builder who raised those timbers. But no one will dare to dwell within its shadows now that the intruder's luxury of concealment is gone. She tipped her head in a knowing way. Nevertheless, I believe that old buildings like that carry echoes of every heart that passed under their roofs. It is our task to listen carefully when the land itself whispers of long-buried truths. Mrs. Penrose nodded, tears glistening. You have always known how to listen, dear friend. I'm so grateful. She offered Miss Marple a heartfelt smile before turning to rejoin the others. Miss Marple lingered a moment under the golden sky, her silhouette slender and composed. She reflected on the journey, a whisper beneath the floorboards of Forkerside Cottage, a hidden codicil shielding Meadows End Farm, and the treachery of a man who traded trust for gain. Yet through it all, the village's warmth and the strength of family prevailed. The mystery had unfurled strand by strand, each clue woven together by patient observation. She glanced down at her hands, folded in front of her, then looked toward the horizon where lanterns glowed in the vicarage windows. For Miss Marple, there was solace in knowing that, sometimes, supposing the softest whisper could indeed echo the loudest truth, and that, in unraveling secrets, one need only listen to the gentle stirrings in the most ordinary places beneath the floorboards of a humble cottage, within the hush of an ancient barn, or in the resolute heart of a devoted family. With serenity settled in her steps, she made her way back toward the parlor, where fellowship and resolution awaited. Outside, the evening breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the final promise that, while mysteries may echo in time-worn corners, they yield at last to those who look with kindness, speak with patience, and trust in the enduring light of truth. Chapter 7. Echoes and Revelations. The morning sun rose pale and gentle over a little woodside, filtering through mist that clung to the hedgerows and thatched rooftops. Forkerside Cottage lay bathed in dew-sprinkled light, its garden radiating the scent of damp earth and rose blossoms. Inside the parlor, Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, poring over the torn scraps of paper retrieved from Foxglove Barn the previous day. Beside her, Inspector Craddock examined his notes. Mrs. Penrose and Edward Smith readied themselves for the day's task. A thorough examination of the barn to uncover any lingering evidence of the intruder's identity. Martin Penrose had insisted on accompanying them as well, determined to ensure no injustice marred the resolution of his cousin's claim by 8 o'clock. The quartet gathered at the cottage door, each equipped for the damp chill, stout boots, waterproof coats, and Miss Marple ever prepared, a small lantern swinging from her wrist. A heavy carriage awaited at the inn, kindly offered by the vicar, who had declared the cause worthy of his finest horses. As they climbed aboard Mrs. Penrose, pale but resolved, Edward determined yet apprehensive, Martin nervously composed. In Craddock, vigilant Miss Marple settled herself near the door, gazing toward the looming silhouette of Foxglove Barn in the near distance. The carriage jolted onto the rutted lane leading west, past fields where sheep grazed in the morning mist, and beside a slow-moving stream whose banks were fringed with reeds. Conversation was sparse, each person lost in thought. At a bend in the road, Thomas, the vicar's groom, reined in the horses and pointed. "Just beyond these oaks, ma'am," he said to Miss Marple. She nodded, offering a polite smile, and Thomas guided the horses onward until the worn outline of the barn appeared through the trees, its timbers darkened by age and neglect. They alighted near the old well that stood at the barn side, the spot where Miss Marple had warned a youthful intruder might hide. The previous day's afternoon sun had revealed footprints within the hayloft and near the old stable stall. Today, the barn seemed even quieter, as though awaiting their arrival. Craddock produced his notebook, checking the time. 9 o'clock. "Let us begin." Miss Marple raised her lantern and led the way through the creaking double doors. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof planks, creating shafts of dust motes that draped the interior in an otherworldly glow. Hay was strewn about, half-rotten. Sacks sagged in corners, and the ladder to the loft stood askew. Yet deeper within Miss Marple's keen eye noted something new. Near the back wall of the main chamber, a faint line of discoloration in the wooden floorboards suggested a hastily covered hole, one that had not been apparent during their first visit. "Look there," she murmured, pointing to the floor. "Someone replaced boards here, I suspect, after removing something. Inspect, please, Mr. Craddock." He knelt, gently prying at the boards with a small iron tool from his pocket. The wood gave way, revealing a shallow pit in the earth beneath. Inside lay a tangle of papers, yellowed and brittle. Edward knelt beside him, heart pounding. "Those are the missing pages torn from the diary. I recognized my grandmother's handwriting." Delicately, Craddock extracted the pages and laid them atop a clean cloth Miss Marple offered. They numbered for a letter addressed to my darling AP and 3 sheets of legal parchment bearing signatures and seals that had been carefully scraped away. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Someone wished to remove not only the diary, but any trace of the codicil's legal instruction. The scraped seals indicate an attempt to obliterate identification. Notice how the seal on this parchment once bore the Greystone Bank emblem. She traced a finger over the faint outline. Martin stared at the documents, astonishment mingling with concern. Who would be so determined to erase Grandpa's instructions? It could only be someone with knowledge of the safe deposit and a motive to seize everything land, deeds, perhaps even meadows and farms unknown to the family. But who? Craddock rose, dusting his hands. Let us search the loft. The lad who retrieved the diary and letters may have passed through there to drop these pages. He gestured to the ladder. Edward climbed first, cautious of the unstable rungs. Once in the loft, he paused, then whispered, "Miss Marple, Mr. Craddock, look at this." He pointed to a small wooden stool overturned near the eaves, a single, muddy boot print on its seat. Nearby lay fragments of charcoal pencil marks on a wooden beam. Miss Marple climbed up to join them, dusting off the beam and revealing a hastily drawn sketch of a map, the outline of a manor fields, and the notation, Smythe Estate. Beneath it, a name scrawled in rough script, H. Thompson. She frowned. This indicates the intruder. One of intruders was none other than Mr. Harmon Thompson, the solicitor who first aided Mrs. Penrose in settling her late husband's affairs. He must have sought to manipulate the codicil to his own ends. Edward's jaw clenched. Mr. Thompson. He was always there when our family needed guidance. I cannot believe he would resort to theft. He clutched the diary pages protectively. Miss Marple set her lantern down. We must consider that Thompson, in his respected position, knew of the codicil's existence and perhaps believed he could obtain the estate by destroying the evidence. He likely planted Edward to find the diary in order to draw suspicion away from himself. She turned to Craddock. "Inspector, have we questioned Mr. Thompson yet?" Craddock shook his head. "Not formally. We were focused on securing the codicil. I confess I did not suspect him. I had assumed greed might lie elsewhere in the family. This trace here changes everything." Miss Marple leaned toward the map. "Note how this sketch indicates a path from Penrose land to the back entrance of Foxglove Barn. Clearly, he used that route. We should search his chambers and bath and his office here in Norbury." Martin stepped forward, face pale. "I must confront him. He acted in secret, betrayed my trust. He must answer for it. I will accompany you, Miss Marple, to his chambers." He turned to Edward, concern in his eyes. "Do not fear, cousin. We shall set this right." In the loft, Mrs. Penrose remained below, aided by Craddock in retrieving the pit's contents. She watched them work with quiet anguish, smoothing her shawl about her shoulders. Oh dear, to think a trusted solicitor could sink so low. Yet it explains the scrapped seals. He sought to keep his plots concealed from both family and bank. Craddock descended with the papers. All these fragments must be preserved. I will lock them in evidence. Mrs. Penrose, I advise you to petition for Mr. Thompson's arrest immediately. He looked toward the loft hatch. "Miss Marple, do you see anything else of importance up here?" Miss Marple glanced about, her gaze resting on a dusty leather satchel propped against a rafter. Bore a small brass plate engraved H. Thompson, Esquire. She opened it gingerly to find a set of legal ledgers, entries dating back years, and a ledger marked with irregular withdrawals. More tellingly, tucked inside was a scrap of paper in clean handwriting, listing sums paid to Foxglove Observer in Norbury undercover. Clues to hush money, no doubt. "This bag holds the key to his scheme," she murmured. "He bribed local informants to monitor our activities and keep him apprised of any legal developments." Craddock and Martin exchanged glances. "We shall take this evidence to Inspector Worthington in Norbury at once," Craddock said. "Well, see to arranging his arrest." On the ground level, Edward approached Mrs. Penrose, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Cousin, this ordeal is nearly over. Our grandfather's intentions will be upheld and his memory untainted by dishonesty." She smiled faintly, tears glistening. "Thank you, Edward dear. I only wish no one else had had to suffer such betrayal." She brushed her cheek. "But indeed, the truth emerges, and our family may heal. Miss Marple descended, closing the hatch behind her. She gazed across the barn's dusty floor. I propose we gather everything here and present it to Inspector Craddock. Then, perhaps we can lock this building until the authorities decide its fate. It has heard more secrets than a house in many years. Craddock nodded. Agreed. Us collect these items and return to Little Woodside. Shortly, we will take the suspect into custody. He motioned to Martin and Edward to gather the satchel and documents. As they worked, Craddock carefully sealed the torn parchments in an evidence envelope, signing and dating each fragment. Miss Marple collected the remaining scraps of paper in the charcoal map in a small leather folder she always carried for such occasions. By mid-morning, they piled into the carriage once more, each carrying a sense of relief and weariness. Mrs. Penrose, now steady-eyed, accepted a supportive arm from Edward as they climbed aboard. Martin rode beside Craddock on the carriage bench, his face drawn, yet resolute, and Miss Marple took her usual place, the leather folder on her lap. The horses trotted through familiar lanes, past hedges now adorned with clusters of honeysuckle, and toward the vicarage, where they would await news of the solicitors' fate. Once they reached the cottage, Inspector Craddock explained the plan. I will send a telegram to Inspector Worthington in Norbury, requesting that Mr. Harmon Thompson be detained on suspicion of theft, destruction of legal documents, and bribery. We have sufficient evidence for his arrest. Meanwhile, let us secure these items in the vicarage's strong room until the legal process unfolds. Miss Marple settled the folder on the parlor table. I trust that the police will handle Grandfather into a ribboned frame for display. Miss Marple carried her knitting basket, the wool set aside in favor of a small purse, in which she tucked the final receipts for the farm transfer. As the sun tipped toward early evening, lanterns flickered on in the parish hall, and villagers began to drift in, farmers fresh from the fields, shopkeepers dusting off aprons, and children clutching bunches of wildflowers. A hush settled as Mrs. Parker raised her hand to signal the start of tea. Tables groaned beneath the weight of scones, tea sandwiches, and pastries, while kettles hissed and hymn-singing birds chirped outside. Reverend Parker cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Tonight we honor the Penrose family, Mrs. Penrose, whose courage has inspired us, Edward Smith, who proved his rightful claim with honor, and Martin Penrose, who upheld the family name with grace. Let us offer thanks for the resolution of this matter and the bonds of community that sustain us. Polite applause filled the hall as Mrs. Penrose rose, her smile humble but bright. She hesitated, then spoke softly. I am touched by your kindness and support. It has been a difficult time, but I feel blessed by family, by friends, and by all of you. I wish to share these flowers, grown in my own garden, for you all to take home as a token of gratitude. She handed out small posies of primroses and violets, and murmurs of appreciation fluttered through the room. Edward, standing beside his grandmother, added, I thank you all as well. Meadows End Farm will prosper under my stewardship, and I promise that its produce and livelihood will be shared with the village. He tapped his teacup. 2 new beginnings. A warm cheer rose, and the hall overflowed with laughter and conversation. Miss Marple settled into a chair by the window, watching neighbors greet one another. Children's sample cakes and friendships renew. The sense of unity and hope was palpable. Later, when the gathering slowed and the lantern's glow softened, villagers drifted homeward, clutching their floral tokens. Inspector Craddock approached Miss Marple as he prepared to leave. The magistrate has adjourned Thompson's hearing until next week, but the charges remain. I will see to his eventual conviction. He offered her a nod. Thank you for your assistance, Miss Marple. Little Woodside is in your debt. Miss Marple inclined her head. It was nothing more than listening carefully to what the land and the people had to say. She gestured around. Okay, them renewed friendships, spring in their step. That is reward enough. Craddock smiled, tipping his hat as he departed. The village lay quiet under the pink afterglow of sunset, its homes darkening one by one, and the air carried the promise of tomorrow's light. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose returned to Forkerside Cottage, they paused at the gate to watch a family of swallows swoop across the sky. The roses in the garden were turning their first vivid blush, and the grass whispered beneath the twilight breeze. Mrs. Penrose turned to her friend. "Thank you, dear Miss Marple. I feel as though Grandpa's spirit hovers here, content that all is set aright." Miss Marple wrapped an arm around Mrs. Penrose's shoulders. "He would be pleased, I am sure. And as for the future, you have a fine grandson in Edward Wise beyond his years. Meadows and farm shall flourish once more." They stepped onto the porch, where a gentle fire glowed in the parlor hearth. Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, and Mrs. Penrose arranged a folded quilt across her lap. Okay, each had a cup of warm cocoa and indulgence after the evening's festivities. Miss Marple gazed into the dancing flames. There is a certain symmetry to how things have unfolded. The whisper beneath the floorboards was quiet, but persistent, demanding to be heard. Once we listened, the true voice of the family emerged, one of love, loyalty, and rightful inheritance. She paused, sipping the cocoa. And, though Mr. Thompson tried to hush that voice, it could not be silenced. Mrs. Penrose reached for Miss Marple's hand. "I will never forget how you guided us. I only hope that if any trouble arises again, though I pray it does not, shall remember your lessons, to trust my instincts and to ask the right questions." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle. "That, dear Mrs. Penrose, is the essence of wisdom. People and places hold stories sometimes in the faintest murmur. We need only pay attention." A comfortable silence settled, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft call of a nightingale outside. In that moment, the past's troubles felt distant as the promise of spring filled the room with warmth. Across the garden, a single moth traced a lazy figure eight through the lamplight. The stars blinked into being overhead. As the hour grew late, Mrs. Penrose rose to retire. She placed the grandfather's letter in the framed codicil on the mantel, where they glowed softly in the hearth's light. "Good night, Miss Marple. Sleep well." Miss Marple nodded, stretching and closing her eyes briefly as though already dreaming. "Good night, my dear. May you rest peacefully." The house settled into silence, every creak and sigh becoming part of the night's lullaby. In the gentle darkness, Miss Marple remained awake just a moment longer, listening to the faint sound of distant church bells, reminders that life, though marked by mysteries and challenges, continues with steadiness and grace. For beyond the walls of Forkerside Cottage, little Woodside slept under the watchful gaze of a caring community, its heart steady, its spirit undimmed. And in that hush, Miss Marple recognized once more that the quietest truths are the ones most worth hearing, the echoes that guide us to justice, compassion, and the warmth of spring's quiet promise. Chapter 8. Spring's Quiet Promise, the week that followed the revelation of Harmon Thompson's betrayal and Edward Smythe's rightful claim to a quarter of the Penrose estate settled over Little Woodside like a gentle breeze, stirring the first blossoms of spring into scented bloom. Forkerside Cottage, which had been shrouded in tension and worry, now breathed an air of relief and renewal. On a bright Tuesday morning, Miss Marple rose early and found Mrs. Penrose already at the parlor window, gazing with a mingled look of wonder and gratitude at the garden beyond. "How lovely the roses look in the morning light," Mrs. Penrose murmured, smoothing her floral skirt and humming softly as she arranged cushions on the settee. "I hardly recognize this cottage as the same place where I paced, terrified, just days ago." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and slid it across the table. Spring has its way of restoring harmony, she said. Troubles can seem less burdensome when the world outside awakens. She drew up a chair. Tell me how you have been since Mr. Thompson's arrest. Mrs. Penrose lifted the teacup, tracing the rim with one slender finger. The bank documents arrived yesterday, confirming Edward's quarter. And Martin has already drawn up a formal lease for Mr. Hobbs to continue till Edward decides his path. I feel as though a great weight has been lifted from my shoulders. A pause, then she added, I do wonder what will become of Thompson. Charity alone cannot so easily excuse his betrayal of a family he claimed to serve. Miss Marple tapped her teacup thoughtfully. Inspector Craddock sent word that Thompson is to appear before Magistrate Worthington this afternoon. He faces charges of theft, destruction of legal documents, and conspiracy. I suspect the court will show little leniency once all evidence is laid bare. Mrs. Penrose's eyes softened. Good. He must be held accountable. Yet, I cannot help but feel a pang. He was once a trusted friend. She sighed. But trust misplaced can have dire consequences. Just then, a knock sounded at the front door, and Mrs. Penrose stood to answer it. She opened onto a modest bouquet of spring flowers, daffodils, bluebells, and primroses tied with a pale ribbon. A small card lay tucked among the blooms. Mrs. Penrose's lips curved into a tearful smile as she read the script. With heartfelt gratitude from my dear Edward. Beyond the flowers lay her grandson Edward Smythe himself, bearing a wicker basket of fresh eggs from his mother's farm and a shy look of affection. Grandmother, he said, his voice soft but steady. Good morning. She embraced him quickly, tears in her eyes. Oh, Edward, you are a dear. Thank you for these. He placed the basket on the small side table and removed a second envelope from his coat pocket. I also wished to give you this, he said, pressing the envelope into her hand. A note I found in Grandpa's study addressed to you. I thought it best you have it. Mrs. Penrose withdrew the envelope with gentle curiosity and slid it open. Inside lay a letter penned in her grandfather's hand, dated April 1917. My dearest Abigail, should you ever consider leaving Forkaside Cottage, know that this home is yours to keep in memory of my devotion. The deeds to Meadows End Farm shall remain in your safekeeping until you choose to pass them on to the next generation. It is my hope that in time this land continues to provide for those you love, as it once did for me. Ever faithfully yours, Edmund Smythe. She pressed the letter to her heart. Grandfather left this as well. She looked up, eyes glistening. He truly thought of everything, even how to care for me. She reached out to Edward. I had no idea this existed. Edward knelt before her. I discovered it among his old papers. I thought you should have it. It seems he wished to ensure you've always felt at home here, no matter the circumstances. Miss Marple, who had been observing silently, smiled warmly. It is a lovely testament to his affection. Now, with this letter and the codicil secured, you may face the future confidently, dear Mrs. Penrose. Mrs. Penrose rose and unfolded the letter again, smoothing the paper. Thank you both. I believe now that no matter what may come, I will never feel alone. Edward stood, tipping his hat. I must return to Meadows End and meet with Mr. Hobbs this morning. He has questions about the lease for the season. He offered Miss Marple a respectful nod. Thank you for all you have done, Miss Marple. Touched his arm. You have shown great fortitude, Edward. I have no doubt you will make a fine steward of the farm. He bowed and departed. The door closed softly behind him, leaving a hush in the room. After breakfast, Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose walked down the gravel path toward the vicarage, where Inspector Craddock awaited with news of Thompson's court appearance. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Emily Parker, greeted them at the door with a cheerful curtsy and guided them into a small sitting room where Craddock sat with several parcels and documents before him. "Good morning, ladies," Craddock said, standing as they entered. He offered Miss Marple a cup of tea, and then turned to Mrs. Penrose. "The magistrate has issued a warrant for Thompson's remand to the Norbury jail. His hearing will take place tomorrow, and bail was denied due to the seriousness of his actions." Mrs. Penrose exhaled, relief mingled with sorrow. "I am grateful, Inspector, though I regret that it came to this. He led me to believe he served our best interests." Craddock placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Sometimes those we trust most are the ones we must scrutinize most closely." "Okay, but you handled the situation with great courage," Miss Marple patted Craddock's shoulder. "Well done, dear fellow. Now that Thompson is in custody, we should think of lighter matters, perhaps a small gathering in the village to celebrate Edward's inheritance and thank those who helped." Craddock gave a thoughtful nod. "That would be a welcome event. I know the Vicar's Parish Hall would be available. Perhaps tomorrow evening, after Thompson's hearing, villagers could gather for tea and cake." Mrs. Penrose's face brightened. "Yes, a celebration would be lovely. Edward will surely be pleased, and I would like to express my gratitude to you all." Miss Marple rose. "Then let us spread the word. Shall be an informal affair, no speeches, just fellowship, together." They walked into the vicarage garden, where bursts of primroses and crocuses signaled that spring had nearly replaced winter. The vicar, Reverend Samuel Parker, pruned a bush of budding forsythia and joined them with a friendly smile. "Ah, Mrs. Penrose, Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock has informed me of a small celebration. The parish hall is yours tonight, should you wish it." Reverend Parker wiped his hands on a leather apron. "I will instruct Mrs. Parker to prepare enough tea for half the village, and perhaps some buns from Mrs. Green's bake shop. It will be a joyous event to mark new beginnings." Okay. Mrs. Penrose and Miss Marple exchanged delighted glances. "Thank you, Reverend," Mrs. Penrose said. "We are most grateful." Reverend Parker gazed at Mrs. Penrose with fondness. "Your family has long been a pillar of this community. It is only fitting we join together." "Okay, with that," he returned to his pruning, leaving the two women and Craddock to bask in the soft hum of spring. As the afternoon wore on, preparations for the gathering began in earnest. Mrs. Parker, a petite woman with a kindly manner, oversaw the layout of tables in the parish hall. White linen tablecloths, china teacups, and mismatched crockery in cheerful patterns. Mrs. Green, the village baker, delivered platters of scones, lemon tarts, and Victoria, sponge enough to satisfy any sweet tooth. Outside, children scampered about in the churchyard, chasing stray rabbits that darted through the daffodils. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took the opportunity to visit Foxglove Barn one final time, accompanied by Inspector Craddock and Martin Penrose. The barn, now empty of intruders and the scattered evidence carefully packed away, stood silent beneath pale clouds. Barefoot lambs gamboled in the field beyond, oblivious to the barn's history. Inside, the boards Miss Marple had pried up lay, replaced, and the dusty hay that once concealed the hidden pit had been cleared away. "It is rather peaceful now," Martin observed, hands in his pockets. "I half wonder if we should leave the barn standing as a reminder to stay vigilant, but also to honor how its secrets came to light." Miss Marple traced the weathered beams with her fingertips. "Old places like this remember more than we do. They hold echoes of every secret and every betrayal. But now that it has given up its final mysteries, its presence may remind us of the value of truth." She glanced at Craddock. "And no further danger lingers here." Craddock nodded, surveying the barn's plain interior. "I have ordered the barn locked until the court gives further instructions. For now, it can remain as part of the Penrose property, perhaps a shelter for livestock or an implement store." He smiled. "I trust the intruder has learned his lesson." Martin patted the ladder's rung and offered Miss Marple his arm. "Let us return, dear lady. Our afternoon awaits in the parish hall." Together, they stepped into the bright sunlight. Outside, the scent of wildflowers drifted on a gentle breeze, and, for a moment, even the barn's gabled silhouette seemed almost content, its walls having finally surrendered their long-hidden whispers. Back at Forkside Cottage, Mrs. Penrose, Miss Marple, and Edward prepared to grace the gathering in the late afternoon. Edward had darkened his hair with a neat part. He carried himself with quiet pride as he affixed a small boutonniere to his jacket lapel and daffodil to match the village's first blooms. Mrs. Penrose, resplendent in a soft pink dress with delicate lace trim, pinned the letter from Plunk. Mrs. Penrose blushed, but nodded. "Yes, we shall lay a wreath by the oak tree near the barn, his favorite spot. Kay, if you don't mind, Clara and Miss Marple could help with its wreath." Clara's eyes sparkled. "I would be honored." She motioned for the florist's delivery of fresh wisteria and lavender. Miss Marple and Clara arranged the blossoms into a simple but elegant wreath, tying the stems with a ribbon of deep green. Mrs. Parker and Craddock watched approvingly as the two women worked in soft conversation. Afterward, Miss Marple returned to her chair as Clara draped the scarf neatly over the back of the armchair. "I shall wear it tomorrow to keep the chill off during the wreath ceremony," Clara said. "Thank you." Miss Marple smiled. "You are very welcome, dear." Mrs. Parker lifted her teacup. "We must rest now while we can. The afternoon will be busy. Spectre, will you be joining us for the parade of livestock and the cakewalk?" Craddock chuckled. "I would not miss it for anything. I hear Edward's orchard apples will be featured in a judging contest." Mrs. Penrose's eyes shone with pride. "Yes, he brought some samples to the vicarage last evening. I think they will win. First prize." Craddock grinned. "We shall see. I am partial to apple tarts myself." As conversation drifted to recipes and gardening tips, a quiet contentment settled over the room. In that peaceful moment, the specter of Thompson's dark schemes felt distant. Outside, the village prepared to celebrate the renewal of community and the promise that new seeds planted in both soil and friendship would flourish for years to come. Miss Marple leaned back, closing her eyes just for a moment. The warmth of summer sun streamed through the window, bathing the parlor in light. She thought of the barn, now empty of secrets, of Meadows End Farm, resurrected by Edward's steady hand, and of Mrs. Penrose, secure in a home her grandfather had loved. The gentle hum of village life swept through her mind, and she realized that, in the world of whispers beneath floorboards and hidden codicils, it was the quiet truth, nurtured by kindness, upheld by justice that endured. And as the village's laughter and chatter drifted from the square outside, Miss Marple opened her eyes and smiled, ready for the next thread of life's tapestry to weave itself into the fabric of Little Woodside. Chapter 9. Shadows of Resettlement. The sun rose crisp and clear over Forkside Cottage, illuminating the garden where the first roses of summer timidly opened their petals. Miss Marple sat on the low stone wall outside the parlor, knitting a pale blue scarf, her eyes tracing the meandering shapes of honeybees as they flitted among the blossoms. Inside, Mrs. Penrose moved with a lightness of step not seen since the dark days before Thompson's treachery was laid bare. Edward Smythe had returned to Meadows End Farm early that morning, leaving behind a basket of fresh produce for his grandmother. As Miss Marple watched, Mrs. Penrose appeared at the cottage door, holding a teacup and saucer, steam curling from the warm brew. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Penrose called softly as she approached. "I thought you might like some tea in the garden." Miss Marple smiled, setting aside her knitting. "Thank you, Abigail. It's a fine morning for tea." Mrs. Penrose settled beside her on the wall, handing over the china cup decorated with tiny roses. The fragrance of Earl Grey mingled with summer's blooms. Miss Marple inhaled deeply, as though committing the moment to memory. I visited the vicar earlier, Mrs. Penrose said, stirring her tea. He's organizing a small charity fete next week to aid village projects. I thought we might offer some of Edward's farm produce in a raffle or stall. Everyone seems keen to support Meadows End Farm after the codicil matter was settled. A gentle breeze rippled through the hedge. Miss Marple sipped her tea and considered. That would be an excellent way to celebrate the farm's return to productive use, and it will help reinforce the sense of community that has brought little Woodside through these troubles. Mrs. Penrose nodded. I shall speak to him about it. It seems appropriate that the villagers share in our good fortune. She paused, glancing at Miss Marple's knitting. See, you are making that scarf again. For whom is it intended this time? Miss Marple chuckled. For the vicar's niece, Miss Clara Parker. She mentioned she felt a chill when reading in the parish library. I thought a light scarf would be of service. She's quite fond of periwinkle blue. Ah, yes, Mrs. Penrose said, watching Miss Marple's needles fly. She is a dear girl, very considerate of everyone. She has spent much time here, helping me learn new recipes using Edward's produce. Miss Marple nodded. Clara's baking is quite famous in the village. Her gingerbread is the envy of half the county. She paused, lowering her knitting. I have been thinking of the barn at Foxglove, Abigail. Now that it stands empty, I wonder if we might restore it in some modest way of storage for hay or a shelter for livestock, as Craddock suggested. It seems a pity to leave it to decay. Mrs. Penrose closed her eyes and thought. I think the idea has merit. Edward might be willing to invest in repairing the roof and floorboards. It would benefit the farm's winter stock. I shall speak with him. Miss Marple smiled, pleased that Abigail's sense of purpose had returned so fully. Indeed, a practical barn would ensure the legacy of your grandfather's holdings continues to serve the community. Just then, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted toward them. Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose turned to see Martin Penrose approaching, on horseback, a broad-brimmed hat shading his face and a sheaf of papers tucked under his arm. He dismounted with the assurance of a man whose affairs had found equilibrium, though his expression carried traces of concern. Good morning to both of you, Martin greeted, removing his hat. I hope I haven't interrupted anything. Not at all, Mrs. Penrose replied, standing to greet him. We were just planning for the fete. She handed him a freshly brewed cup of tea. Martin took it gratefully and settled onto the grass, tucking his papers beside him. Thank you. I wanted to discuss something Edward wrote last night. He has found an interested tenant for the parcel of land adjacent to Meadows End. Mr. Hobbs recommended it. Mr. Ridley, a retired schoolmaster, wishes to rent it for a small orchard. Edward thinks it may be a fine addition. I shall draft the lease this afternoon. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow approvingly. It seems Edward has a keen sense for harmonious arrangements, both for the farm and for community relations. An orchard would be lovely, and Schoolmaster Ridley would likely care for the land well. Martin nodded. Exactly, but the reason I really came was to speak of Thompson's case. I received a letter from Inspector Worthington this morning. Thompson has pleaded guilty to the charges and is being held until sentencing next week. The magistrate was particularly disturbed by the tampering with the codicil and the bribes paid to keep him informed. Mrs. Penrose's expression hardened at mention of Thompson's betrayal. I trust he will get what he deserves. It is not merely theft, but a betrayal of trust that cut deepest. Martin took a gentle sip. Yes, it seems the court will impose a substantial sentence. Meanwhile, his office in Norbury is to be closed, and his legal license suspended. His clients will have the right to petition for reassignment of counsel. I shall ensure Mrs. Penrose's estate affairs are finally settled properly without any further complications. Miss Marple folded her knitting and gazed at the distant hills. I am glad the law has acted decisively. It gives the village confidence in justice. She paused a moment, then asked, "Speaking of the village, I attended Mrs. Parker's tea earlier. She mentioned several villagers were still curious about the spyglass found under the floorboards. Have we discovered more about its provenance?" Artine reached into his satchel and produced a small brass spyglass, its leather covering worn but intact. "Yes, this belonged to your grandfather, Mrs. Penrose. He used it during his travels in the Great War, so he told me. He kept it here in secret, beneath a false board. Thompson likely intended to sell it, given its antiquity." Mrs. Penrose's eyes softened as she took it from him, tracing the initials E.S. onto its brass collar. "I remember him showing it to me once. He said it reminded him that, even in the darkest times, one need only shift their perspective to see light. I am grateful to have it back." Miss Marple reached out to steady Abigail's hand. It was another part of the inheritance that Thompson overlooked. Well recovered, indeed. She turned to Martin. "Have you considered a suitable place to display it? Perhaps here in the parlor, so it may serve as a reminder." Martin smiled. "That seems fitting. I will see that it is cleaned and placed in a display case on the mantel. We shall keep it safe." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the chorus of finches heralding mid-morning. Then Mrs. Penrose stood and set her empty cup on the wall. "I ought to prepare a luncheon for Mrs. Parker's visit. She will arrive soon to finalize the fete arrangements. Thank you both for your help." Abigail departed toward the kitchen. Martin rose as well. "Shall join you in the parlor later with those lease papers. Miss Marple, I believe the vicar's niece would appreciate your scarf if it is finished." Miss Marple nodded, rising and tucking her knitting basket under her arm. "Very well. I shall see to that, then return to tend my begonias." She smiled as she watched Martin ascend his horse and ride off toward the village center. Moments later, Miss Marple strolled through the gate and along the path toward the village green. The rickety wooden sign announcing a little woodside swayed gently in the breeze, adorned with trailing ivy. Ahead, the parish hall stood dressed in bunting for the upcoming fete, pastel flags fluttering above the doorway, and a chalkboard propped outside reading, "Charity Fete in aid of Meadows End Farm Orchard, this Saturday." A small queue of villagers gathered at the wooden booth set up for advance donations, handing coins to Mrs. Parker and her helpers. Miss Marple stopped to speak to Mrs. Emma Green, the baker, who offered her a warm roll. "Take a seed cake, Miss Marple, fresh from the oven just baked." She took the cake and pressed a shilling into Emma's gloved hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. The cake will be perfect for Mrs. Parker's tea." Emma beamed. "Oh, we're all so pleased that the farm's future is assured. Mr. Ridley will plant the orchard, and soon we may have fresh apples for pies." She winked. "You know, when Thompson's misdeeds were revealed, I thought the farm might be lost, but now," Miss Marple patted her arm, "indeed, the community spirit and the rule of law guided us back to calm." She tucked the seed cake under her arm and continued toward the vicarage, humming a simple melody. Inside the parlor, Miss Marple placed her knitting basket on a side table and settled into her favorite armchair. Clara Parker, the vicar's niece, was perched behind the high-backed chair, adjusting a framed needlepoint. When she saw Miss Marple enter, she rose eagerly. "Aunt Emily said you had something for me." Miss Marple retrieved the pale blue scarf and presented it to Clara. "Just finished. I thought you might find it useful when you're reading in the library." Clara ran her fingers over the soft yarn, eyes bright. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's beautiful, just the shade I love." As Clara draped the scarf around her shoulders, Mrs. Parker entered with Mrs. Penrose and Inspector Craddock. They exchanged cordial greetings, and Mrs. Parker set out porcelain cups and a silver teapot on the lace-covered table. The atmosphere was one of cheerful anticipation as each woman prepared for the fete. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Parker," said, pouring tea. "Have drawn up the schedule. Games at 2 o'clock, raffle at 3. And at 4 we shall host a small relaying in honor of Mr. Smythe's grandfather, whose memory inspired all of this week's events. And forging bonds that would endure beyond the day's festivities." Mrs. Penrose leaned closer to Miss Marple, her voice soft. "You have given me a gift beyond measure, dear friend. My home, my family, and my place in this village are more secure than I ever imagined." She inhaled deeply, as though committing the moment to memory. "I will tend to the roses in the garden, but my heart has found new blooms in the orchard and community." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes reflecting a serene wisdom. True treasures often lie in quiet places beneath floorboards, than old barns, or in the simple act of caring for one another. We must always listen for the faintest whispers of need or hope, for they guide us toward harmony. The sun dipped toward the horizon. The fate's final song, an old ballad of homecoming, sung in 4-part harmony by local voices, rang across the orchard. Children danced beneath strings of lanterns. Couples strolled along the newly laid orchard paths, and Martin and Edward exchanged plans for winter repairs and spring plantings. Miss Marple rose and brushed her skirt, listening to the cadence of celebration. She joined Mrs. Penrose beneath the oak. They placed a small bench and plaque in memory of Edmund Smythe's. May his vision continue to blossom. Together, they watched as the plaque caught the sun's last rays, a testament to a man whose foresight had guided a family through darkness. As dusk settled, Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose strolled back toward Forkside Cottage, their footsteps soft upon the grass. The laughter and music of the fete drifted behind them, blending with the evening breeze. Fireflies rose from the orchard, tiny lanterns guiding them home inside the cottage. A single lamp glowed in the parlor's window. The spyglass gleamed atop the mantel, and the grandfather's letter rested beside it, framed in polished wood. Miss Marple poured a final cup of tea, handing one to Mrs. Penrose before settling into her armchair. Mrs. Penrose sank into her own chair, gazing at the flickering fire. "Thank you, dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Penrose said, her voice soft with gratitude, for seeing beyond the surface, listening to what was unspoken, and steering us toward truth. She raised her teacup in a toast to friendship and to the gentle power of compassion. Miss Marple mirrored the gesture to family, both of blood and of heart, and to every humble whisper that leads us to light. She sipped her tea, smiling as the warmth spread. Outside, a nightingale sang its final song. In that quiet moment, little Woodside rested, a village renewed by community and guided by those who refused to let secrets fester. The barn, once a place of hidden voices, now sheltered honest endeavors. The orchard, with its fragile saplings, looked to a future of abundance and shared joy. And Forkside Cottage, with its lace curtains and rose-scented air, stood as a haven where truth had triumphed. Miss Marple closed her eyes, content. She knew that new stories would bloom here, gentler mysteries of daily life, or whispers of kindness would lead neighbors to one another. For in the end, it was not only the resolution of a crime that mattered, but the harmonious growth of a community bound by trust. And as the last glow of the sun faded, the cottage, the barn, and the orchard whispered their own promises that with care, compassion, and the courage to listen, every family, every village could find its path from darkness into light. Chapter 10. A time for disclosure. The dawn of the fete arrived with a golden blush across Little Woodside. From the roof of Forkside Cottage, Mrs. Penrose watched the village awaken, shutters opening, the gentle stir of bakers' carts rolling down the lane, and the tinkling laughter of children as they raced through the dukest grass toward the parish hall. In the parlor, Miss Marple adjusted the embroidered ribbons on the wreath she and Clara Parker had fashioned. pausing to admire the lavender and wisteria blooms nestled within. Outside, the spyglass gleaming brass against its velvet case rested on the mantel as a silent testament to Edmund Smythe's steadfast character. At 8 o'clock, Inspector Craddock arrived with a letter in hand, printed on crisp embossed paper. He handed it to Mrs. Penrose, the official notice of sentence for Harmon Thompson. She opened it with trembling fingers, reading aloud in a small voice. Sentenced to 5 years hard labor to commence immediately. All assets to be frozen pending restitution. Relief and sorrow mingled in her eyes. Justice, she whispered. He will feel the weight of his betrayal. Craddock offered a comforting pat. It was a serious offense, destroying legal documents, manipulating an entire family. He must answer for his deeds. The bank's restitution is complicated, but there is hope. Some assets may be recovered. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket. Once the barn is sold or repurposed, some funds may offset costs incurred by Mrs. Penrose. That matter is already in motion. Miss Marple nodded, offering tea in fine china cups to Craddock and Mrs. Penrose. The warmth of friendship filled the air. Let us not dwell on darker days today. There is much to celebrate. By 9 o'clock, Mr. Thomas had delivered Clara's wreath and arranged it in the vicarage's flower cart. As villagers assembled along the broad path leading to the barn site, the procession began. Reverend Parker led the way, followed by Mrs. Penrose and Edward, who bore the wreath with reverent care. Behind them marched Linda and Sam, the vicars, children, bearing buckets of water and gardening tools. Martin Penrose followed with a small spade, ready to break ground. Villagers, farmers, bakers, teachers assembled in clusters, their voices hushed with anticipation. Miss Marple, clad in a simple gray dress and hat, trimmed with violets, surveyed the assembly from the garden gate. She recognized familiar faces. Mrs. Green, clutching a plate of seed cakes, Mr. Hobbs in a straw hat, and Clara Parker, holding Miss Marple's periwinkle scarf draped around her shoulders. The tension that had once gripped the village had dissipated, replaced by a gentle hum of unity and goodwill. Even the barn, its gabled silhouette, dark against rising mist, seemed softened by the dawn light. Reverend Parker cleared his throat. Friends, today we mark not only the restitution of Meadows End Farm, but the renewal of our community's spirit. Let this wreath symbolize rebirth. Those blossoms represent hope. And the land beneath our feet is ready to yield more than crops: friendship, trust, and a shared future. He laid the wreath at the base of the barn's foundation stones, then stepped back. Mrs. Penrose and Edward joined him, Alette's deepening as they knelt. Edward's voice trembled slightly. My grandmother's grandfather cherished this land. Though he has passed, his spirit endures in every blade of grass, in each bud that emerges. We dedicate this orchard to him and to all who cherish honesty, kindness, and community. He paused, gaze flicking toward his grandmother. Mrs. Penrose brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear, her lips curved into a tender smile. Let us plant seeds today, apple saplings for the orchard, promising sweet fruit and seeds of compassion among neighbors. Applause rippled through the crowd as the planting began. Martin turned the soil with firm strokes of his spade, while two young villagers pressed each sapling into place. As the final sapling was nestled, the children scattered petals from the wreath across the fresh earth. Reverend Parker raised his hands. Now, let us pray. A hush fell. He offered a simple blessing for the orchard's growth and for the village's harmony. Kaz then murmured amen, and the crowd exhaled in unison. The planting concluded with laughter and chatter as villagers drifted back toward the parish hall for the remainder of the festivities. Inside the hall, tables bowed beneath the weight of pies, tarts, scones, and jars of honey. Jars of Edward's first orchard, apples, small and crisp, stood in neat rows, waiting for the raffle drawing later that afternoon. Mrs. Green presided over the pastry table, arranging lemon tarts in perfect concentric circles. Children clustered at a table near the windows, coloring paper apples and crafting leaf-shaped place cards. In one corner, a quartet of local musicians tuned fiddles and guitars, preparing to play folk tunes as the cakewalk commenced. Miss Marple strolled among the tables, exchanging kind words with each villager. She stopped by Mrs. Green's table, sampling a dollop of lemon curd on a bite-sized scone. "Delightful, as always," she told the baker. Mrs. Green beamed. "Thanks to Edward's orchard apples, they add that subtle tempts." Miss Marple gave her a small nod before moving on to inspect the raffle tickets. Clara Parker, swinging her arms with youthful enthusiasm, handed trays of tea to Reverend Parker and Inspector Craddock, who sampled various cakes with the appetite of a satisfied detective. As the clock chimed 11, Mrs. Penrose stood at the dais, raising her voice above the lively chatter. "Dear friends, thank you for joining us today. It warms my heart to see everyone gathered here once in doubt, but now united." She hesitated, drawing a gentle breath. "I owe a debt of gratitude to Miss Marple, who guided us, to Inspector Craddock for upholding justice, to Martin for handling legal affairs, and to dear Edward, who has taken Meadows End Farm into his capable hands. Please accept this gift, a small token from the orchard, jars of dried apple rings, made from yesterday's apples." She gestured to a table of neatly wrapped packages. "These are for you to remember today's spirit of renewal." Applause followed as villagers claimed the packages, exchanging smiles and blessings. Edward stepped forward. "I wish also to extend my gratitude. My grandmother's home and inheritance were nearly stolen by one who betrayed our trust. But with your support, we overcame adversity. I promise to share the orchard's yield with you, apples, cider, and pies for the church socials. This farm belongs not only to my family, but to all of you." He offered a small bow. "Hey," and applause echoed throughout the hall. Mrs. Penrose's eyes glistened as she watched Edward. Pride etched upon her face. Reverend Parker cleared his throat. "Now, let us begin the cakewalk." He explained the rules to the assembled children, who lined up beside a strip of colored tape on the wooden floor. As lively fiddle music began, the children walked in a circle, stepping in time to the tune. At each musical pause, they froze in place. The last to stop was eliminated. Gasps and laughter followed until one child emerged victorious, claiming a small jam tart as a prize. The crowd cheered, and the next round began with even more fervor. Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose exchanged amused glances as the younger children giggled and tumbled, savoring each moment. Midday drew near, and the raffle tickets were called. Reverend Parker announced the winners of the orchard apples, passing wicker baskets to delighted farmers whose smiles shone with quiet triumph. Mr. Hobbs, a tenant farmer who had overseen the orchard's planting, beamed as he accepted his prize, a wooden crate of small, rosy apples. A hush fell as Miss Marple was called. She selected a prize of 3 jars of honey from the local apiary, smiling as she accepted them. Inspector Craddock shook his head with mock protest. Half. Being robbed of apples by a lady of superior taste. Laughter filled the hall, knitting villagers closer together. The afternoon waned, and guests drifted outward to the barn site, where Martin and Craddock oversaw the final preparations. They had arranged bright banners across the barn's gabled front, announcing Meadows End Orchard welcomes you. Inside, the floorboards had been lifted and replaced with sturdier planks, and the loft's beams rested upon fresh vertical supports. Edward stood in the center of the barn, gazing up at the rafters lined with birdhouses donated by local children. He turned to Miss Marple. "I wanted you to see the barn's restoration. I plan to use it for storing cured orchard wood, equipment, and a small tasting room in winter. Miss Marple studied the interior with satisfaction. The barn, once a vessel of secrets, now served a noble purpose. You have honored your grandfather's land and this building by giving them new life. She placed a gentle hand on Edward's shoulder. It gladdens me to see it restored so thoughtfully. A soft whistle announced Mrs. Parker's arrival, accompanied by Clara holding a tray of chilled herbal lemonade. They gathered in a small circle beneath the rafters as birds flitted overhead, curious for crumbs. The breeze whispered through the barn's gaps, carrying hints of grass and apple blossoms. Past the threshold, the newly planted orchard gleamed under the sun, its wired mesh fences protecting young trees whose branches bore the promise of autumn's fruit. Outside, laughter echoed from the field as villagers gathered beneath long trestle. Tables laden with platters of cheeses, homemade chutneys, and slices of orchard apple pie. The aroma of roast chicken and fresh bread drifted across the meadow. Miss Marple and Mrs. Penrose took seats beneath an old oak where they watched as the community mingled, friends greeting one another, sharing stories of the past few. Miss Marple and a stranger at the vicar's gate. Chapter 11. The Visitor in Bluet. Was a bright morning in the village of Lydney, St. Mary. One of those early spring days that seemed stitched together with birdsong and the gentle hum of bees waking from winter. The church bell had just chimed to 9 when Mrs. Bantry, always early for her Tuesday errands, paused at the greengrocer's to discuss the price of gooseberries and the scandal of Mrs. Finch's new lawn ornament. At the same time, a stranger arrived at the vicarage. He was tall, thin as a post, and dressed in a well-cut but curiously outdated blue suit. His shoes, despite the dust of travel, gleamed with the polish of someone meticulous about appearances. Purant Lionel Upwater was just tying the final knot in his bean trellis when the man appeared at the garden gate. "Good morning," the stranger said, with the faintest trace of an accent, European, perhaps. "I wondered if I might trouble you for a moment." The vicar, startled but courteous, lowered his trowel. "Of course, it's always time for a visitor. Are you lost?" The man smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, not lost. Only looking for a quiet place to rest. I've walked from the station." Reverend Upwater, who prided himself on Christian charity even more than his ability to quote obscure 17th century sermons, offered tea without hesitation. The man accepted, though he declined biscuits. Within the hour, the stranger had vanished. He left no name, no note, and no trace. By the time Miss Marple heard about the encounter over tea and ginger cake at Mrs. Price Ridley's that very afternoon, the story had changed 3 times. "Some sort of foreign gentleman," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, slicing her cake with military precision. "Or perhaps an agent of the government. You know how they pop in and out, never leaving a forwarding address." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He wore blue, you say?" "Indeed, and vanished within minutes. You know, Jane, if you'll pardon the observation, such people are rarely up to any good." At that precise moment, the church bell rang again. Once for each solemn toll. Then silence by sundown. Constable Reeves was combing the edge of the vicarage garden, for beneath the hedgerow, behind a cluster of half-pruned holly, lay the body of a man. He had not walked away, after all. His head was turned awkwardly toward the earth. One gloved hand curled as if grasping at something in his final moment. The other hand was bare, revealing a curious scar beneath the thumber jagged lightning shape by dusk. The constable had roped off the garden with string. The vicar's wife had fainted twice, and 3 villages had already claimed to recognize the man, though none could agree on his name. Miss Marple, knitting in the window of her rose-covered cottage, paused with a half-formed pearl. Murder, she thought with a sigh, and in the vicarage, of all places. Not 2 hours later, a sergeant from Much Biddleton arrived to take charge. and already the rumors were growing like dandelions. Espionage, blackmail, a secret lover from the past. But Miss Marple, folding her hands over her knitting needles, to cue not of international intrigue nor youthful passions. She thought of the peculiar till Mrs. Price Ridley had so casually mentioned. The visitor had declined biscuits, and no Englishman in his right mind did that, especially not on a country walk. She tapped her finger once on the wooden armrest, a soft sound lost beneath the whisper of twilight. Something was most certainly wrong, and someone, she suspected, was telling lies. Chapter 12. Gossip over gooseberries. The next morning, the village of Lydney St. Mary woke with a collective start, as though the very hedgerows had whispered the news into every cottage window before sunrise. The stranger had been murdered, and not just murdered, but within the quiet borders of the vicarage garden, a spot that had hitherto only known the drama of the bishop's lost sermon notes and a rather aggressive mole infestation at Mrs. Bartlett's shop. The murmurs began before the milk delivery had even arrived. "I told you," hissed Mrs. Simpkins to her friend Dora Lugg. "He looked like trouble from the start." "Men who arrive unannounced always are," remembered the traveling wallpaper salesman in 46. Dora nodded gravely. "Still, to be stabbed like that. Do you think the vicar saw it?" "Heavens no. Reverend Upwater is practically blind without his glasses. And Edith says he was down by the potting shed all morning." Across the lane at the butcher's, Mr. Cooper was offering a quite different theory. "I say he was after something. It's not just here by chance. He asked about the church. When he came in Monday, you know. Asked who lived in which house. It's unnatural curiosity, if you ask me." By the time the chatter reached the tea room, the stranger had been everything from a foreign spy to a jilted lover of Miss Weatherby, who had not had a suitor since 1932, and was still blissfully unaware of the entire affair. Only one person sat quietly amid the buzz of speculation. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking gently over her lap, sipped her tea and watched the room, not rudely, not intrusively, but with the attentive serenity of someone who had seen many things in her long life and missed very little. She did not speak of murder, not yet. Instead, she focused on the incongruities, the little human inconsistencies that fluttered around conversations like unseen midges, the kind most people swatted away. She had already noted that Reverend Upwater's story, relayed by his wife to the grocer's wife to the fishmonger's cousin, had changed twice by breakfast. Initially, he'd claimed the man asked for tea. Then later, that he'd simply asked directions and left immediately. The omission might have been innocent shock, muddled details. After all, but it was worth remembering. More curious was the account of young Leonard Reed, the vicar's assistant, and a boy of barely 19 with a sullen mouth and too much brill cream in his hair. According to him, the visitor never entered the house at all. "But that can't be right," murmured Miss Marple aloud, causing her companion, Mrs. Hartnell, to look up from her scone. "Oh, nothing, dear," said Miss Marple with a smile. "Only wool gathering. You know how these things unsettle one." Mrs. Hartnell, already 3 theories deep about a secret love child of the bishop's, hardly noticed. At midday, Constable Reeves came knocking at Miss Marple's door. He looked harried, as if he'd been asked to alphabetize every gravestone in the parish. "Thought you'd want to know, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his hat between his fingers. The man had no identification on him, not a stitch. His clothes, tailored abroad, nothing British made, and the scar on his hand, military, we think, but foreign, could be German or Yugoslavian. No papers, no luggage, no label in his coat. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod, and no one in the village recognized him. The constable hesitated. "Mrs. Lumley says she saw someone just like him 2 months ago at the train station in Market Hale, but she also thinks the milkman's a reincarnated monk." "So, quite," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. Reeves exhaled. Be honest, we've got nothing to go on. Hund, the chief inspector from Biddleton, is arriving this evening. He'll want something more than village gossip. Gossip, said Miss Marple softly, can be surprisingly revealing, Constable, especially when it contradicts itself. She thanked him for the visit and returned to her parlor window. From there, she could see the vicar's gate, still, watched by a policeman with a clipboard and a growing look of boredom. The holly bush, where the body had been found, was partially trimmed, as if the murder itself had interrupted someone's gardening. Miss Marple's fingers returned to her knitting, but her mind was not on yarn. It was on the peculiar absence of motive. Most village murders, rare as they were, had something emotional at the heart of them. Love, betrayal, greed, even revenge. But this man had no known ties to anyone in Lydney St. Mary. He'd not argued with anyone, stolen anything, or even overstayed his welcome. By most accounts, he had spoken fewer than 50 words, and yet someone had killed him violently. She leaned back in her chair and watched the vicarage. A pair of crows settled on the chimney, cawing noisily in a village where everyone knew everything. This man was a stranger, and Miss Marple found it very hard to believe he had come there by chance. Chapter 13. The Man with No Luggage. By Thursday morning, Lydney St. Mary had settled into a curious rhythm, half real village, half theater stage. People strolled past the vicarage under the pretense of fresh air, but with eyes sharp as hawks, and a great many errands now required detours past the garden gate. Conversations leaned slightly to loud near shop doors and village greens, as if the correct theory, said with enough conviction, might become truth. Inside the vicarage, Reverend Upwater sat at his desk, pale and tight-lipped, making a clumsy effort at his Sunday sermon. Every few lines he struck through his writing and began again. Edith, his wife, stood by the windowsill, polishing a spot that had been polished 3 times already that morning. I can't bear this. Lionel, she said abruptly, breaking the uneasy quiet. Reporters sniffing around. That awful inspector, questioning me twice about whether the man drank his tea. What does it matter if he drank it or not? He was murdered, Lionel. The vicar looked up, flinching slightly. It matters, my dear, because it is all they have. There is no name, no belongings, no background. Okay? We offered the man hospitality, and he died under our holly bush. Edith turned from the window. But why here? Why our garden? We've never harmed a soul. Reverend Upwater didn't reply. Outside, the gate clicked gently in the wind. That same morning, Miss Marple made her customary call to the library. Her visits had never been known to deviate, and Miss Brimsley, the librarian, always had her week's fiction ready. This time, however, Miss Marple lingered beside the local history section, fingers running absently across the dust jackets. Did you know, she said conversationally, that the vicarage was once part of the manor estate? Miss Brimsley blinked. Oh yes, belonged to the Hargraves, long before the war, of course. Sold it in pieces when the 3rd Viscount gambled himself into ruin. Curious how quickly people forget, Miss Marple said with a smile. But houses, remember? She turned to leave. A boy of perhaps 11 ran past the window outside. He wore a school cap, far too big for his head, and carried a paper-wrapped parcel. A moment later, Miss Marple saw him again, this time, sprinting. The ward, the post office, the parcel missing. She paused, then stepped outside. Timothy Cartwright, she called gently. The boy skidded to a halt. Yes, Miss Marple. That parcel you had, where did it go? Mr. Reed took it. Miss said it was for the police. He was coming from the vicarage and told me I'd best not tell anyone I saw it, but I figured you'd ask. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to her cottage, the gears in her mind turning faster now. Leonard Reed, the young assistant, sullen, evasive, and now sneaking off with a package. He hadn't mentioned to the constable or the sergeant by tea time. The chief inspector from Much Biddleton had arrived. Inspector Bullfinch was large, florid, and deeply suspicious of village interference. He brought with him a briefcase, a tight schedule, and an unfortunate tendency to insult by implication. "I have it on good authority," Kay said, pausing to sip tepid coffee in the vicarage parlor, "that this was likely a transient perhaps. A thief casing the place. Wrong house, wrong time. A crime of opportunity." Miss Marple, who had arrived with fresh scones as a show of kindness to the Reverend's wife, sat quietly beside the ficus plant. "Very possible," she murmured, "although I've often noticed that opportunity seldom knocks on strangers' behalf, and rarely while wearing polished shoes." Bullfinch gave her a thin smile. "Quite." She did not press the point. Instead, she asked mildly, "Has the man's coat been examined?" "The lining, perhaps." The inspector frowned. "Of course, it was expensive. No maker's label, though. No initials. Tailored? Yes, but likely second-hand. These foreigners often purchase off the rack abroad." Miss Marple nodded and began to pack up her basket. Just before leaving, she turned to Edith Upwater. "My dear, forgive the imposition, but might I have a look at your guest room?" Edith blinked. Well, it hasn't been used since Lionel's cousin visited, but of course, if you wish." The room was small and immaculate. One white-paned window, a modest bed, a writing desk. The sheets had been changed recently. Miss Marple ran a hand gently along the windowsill, then knelt beside the small waistband. Nothing unusual: tissue, a torn receipt, and a small silver twist of paper, no larger than a fingernail. She held it up, inspecting it. Chocolate wrapper, Belgian, and suddenly she remembered something. Not long ago, at the Easter fete, she had overheard Mrs. Bartlett talking about a man who asked whether the village shop sold Belgian chocolate specifically. Cigarette sticks with the orange sugar. Nobody in Lydney St. Mary ate those. They were practically unknown outside of the continent. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Edith. I do believe I shall return tomorrow." As she walked home, the wind picked up. The church bell rang softly in the distance, echoing through the dusk. She passed the vicarage gate, still watched, still silent, and noted a small smear on the post mud, likely but oddly placed. Too high to be from boots, too low for a shoulder. It told her something. Not everything, not yet, but something. The man had not come from the road. He had come from the side. And Miss Marple, his memory was as sharp as her sewing scissors, suddenly recalled a back path once used by delivery boys long before the war, now overgrown. It's still there, a way in, unseen. Chapter F-14, Whispers in the Vicarage Garden, by Friday morning. The unease in Lydney St. Mary had sunk deeper than village gossip. What had begun as murmured speculation now took the shape of quiet glances exchanged in church pews, incomplete sentences over scones, and a sudden interest in who did or did not lock their garden gates. The weather, as if in sympathy, had grown damp and gray. Miss Marple, however, remained steady. She had spent the evening prior reviewing an old parish map, a gift from Mr. Clement, the previous vicar, who had once described it as more accurate than the census. Her memory of the overgrown footpath at the side of the vicarage had been confirmed. It was marked faintly, "Service path discontinued, 1939. The next morning, she returned to the vicarage under the guise of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Edith Upwater, frailer than before and grateful for company, ushered her inside. Without hesitation. "Everyone thinks we should leave," Edith confessed, lowering her voice as she set the tea tray down. "Even the bishop called well-meaning, of course, Kay, but it's obvious he believes something unsavory must have drawn the man here." Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still in her lap. "Tay, and what do you believe, my dear?" "Tay," Edith hesitated. "I believe Someone wanted him found here, that he didn't choose the vicarage for any ordinary reason. He was left here, perhaps after after the fact, was a shrewd thought. One Miss Marple had considered herself. She leaned in slightly, her tone casual. Do you know if Leonard Reed has been staying on the grounds? Edith's face pinched. Only in the old gardener's cottage. We let him use it while he applies to theological college. But he's been strange lately, snappish, and caught him coming in through the kitchen door late last night. Said he was looking for his pocketbook. Okay, but I know he'd already fetched it earlier. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind tucked the detail away. I wonder, she said gently, whether it would be possible to walk through the garden. Edith blinked. The garden. For air, Miss Marple said with a kindly smile. I find gardens often calm the nerves. Within minutes, she was outside again, accompanied by the soft brush of wind in the hedges and the heavy scent of sodden soil. Stopple stood dutifully by the holly bush, his notebook balanced on one hand like a tray. Morning, Miss Marple, he said with a slight nod. Nothing new, I'm afraid. Quite all right, she replied, crouching beside the bush. Though may I ask, was the body facing toward the house or away? The constable glanced at his notes. Toward, miss, like he'd been turning back. Or maybe trying to crawl. She nodded, her gaze moving beyond the bush, toward the overgrown path, she remembered. With deliberate slowness, she took a few careful steps through the thicket, following the faint trace of trampled grass. It was still there, narrow but walkable. The old path twisted around the side of the vicarage toward a crumbling brick wall that had once marked the estate's rear boundary. And just before the break in the wall, she found it. A torn button, black, matte, finished, slightly scuffed on the edge. Not old, but not new either. She did not touch it with her fingers, but used the edge of a handkerchief to lift it gently. She did not need to take it to the inspector. She already knew where it had come from. Leonard Reed's overcoat. She had seen the missing button 2 days earlier when he passed her outside the post office, clutching a parcel and walking too quickly. She stood there for a moment in the cool wind. The button balanced on her palm like a scale. The question was not whether Leonard Reed had used the path he had. The question was whether he had followed the man or met him there, or ... Worse, as she walked back toward the house, she noticed something else. A small stone statue by the edge of the flower-beater fox with a chipped ear had been recently moved. The grass beneath it was paler, flattened. Someone had placed something beneath it, then retrieved it. Not papers. Too thick. Small object. Perhaps wrapped. Perhaps ... Discarded. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. Back in the village, Inspector Bullfinch had decided to convene an information meeting at the public hall. It was not quite an inquest, nor quite a lecture, but he hoped that if enough people were assembled under one roof, someone might panic or remember something useful. Miss Marple arrived 10 minutes early and sat near the back, knitting calmly as the room filled with villagers. The atmosphere was electrisome, hoping to hear scandal. Others silently terrified it might brush too close to home. Bullfinch cleared his throat and began. The man has not been identified. We know only that he wore European shoes, had no luggage, and bore a scar consistent with wartime injury. He had no connections to anyone in the village that you know of, muttered Mrs. Price Ridley, and no sign of robbery or personal items was found, except the Belgian chocolate wrapper, said Miss Marple quietly. All heads turned. Bullfinch blinked. I beg your pardon, Miss Marple continued knitting. Belgian chocolate, orange sugar sticks. Quite rare in this part of the country. Yet the wrapper was in the waste bin of the vicarage guest room. The inspector frowned. And how did you come by that detail? Oh, said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling faintly. I always check the bins when I visit. People never hide things in plain sight. She left a matter there, but the effect was marked. Leonard Reed, seated 3 rows ahead, had gone visibly pale. Miss Marple observed him quietly, her fingers never pausing over the yarn. There was a story here still concealed, but coming into view. Someone had known the stranger. Perhaps not many, but at least one. And that one had not counted on Miss Marple's eyes or her memory. Chapter 15. A conversation in the churchyard the next day brought with it a blanket of thick mist, curling around hedgerows and lampposts like a veil drawn over the village. Lydney St. Mary, already uneasy, now felt positively shrouded. The chimneys puffed out long plumes of smoke, and figures moved like ghosts along the lanes. Miss Marple, however, was not deterred by a little fog. Quite the contrary, she found people more prone to honesty when the weather blurred their outlines. After her morning tea, she made her way up to the churchyard, a wicker basket in hand, filled with cuttings from her garden and a small parcel of sponge cake for old Mr. Hill, the gravedigger, who had been suffering from rheumatism since Candlemas. She found him tending to the north wall of the cemetery, where the earth rose unevenly and the headstones stood at shy angles, like forgotten schoolchildren. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his flat cap. "That's kind. That is." Bit of cackle put life back in my knees. She smiled. "The village has been in quite a state, Mr. Hill. I thought a little kindness might ease the air." He gave a gruff chuckle and sat on the edge of a low stone. "I hear they still don't know who the poor man was," he said, glancing about. "No name, no past. Bit like planting a seed without knowing what flower it'll be." Miss Marple sat beside him on a flat rock, smoothing her skirt. "You see much from here, I imagine?" "Oh yes," he said, nodding. "More than folk reckon. Quiet eyes catch loud deeds, my dad used to say." "And did your quiet eyes happen to see anything odd this past week? Perhaps someone cutting across from the vicarage late at night, or a stranger taking the path by the hedge?" Mr. Hill scratched his chin. "Now you mention it, I did see young Mr. Reed one evening, Tuesday, I think it was, bit after 9. Came from the side path quick steps, like he didn't want to be seen. Didn't notice me, mind. I was trimming ivy. Carrying anything, Mr. Hill thought. Couldn't say, but his coat looked odd. Bulky under one arm, like he was clutching something close." Miss Marple nodded. Has he been about since?" "Twice. Looked twitchy, like a lad with a secret too big for his boots." That, Miss Marple thought, sounded about right. She thanked Mr. Hill, promised more sponge cake next week, and made her way through the mist toward the rectory lane. As she walked, her thoughts turned like cogs in a well-oiled clock. Leonard Reed had clearly met the man. The parcel, the missing coat button, the evasiveness, these were not signs of an innocent bystander. But guilt of what, exactly? She needed to know more about Leonard. And, as was often the case in Lydney St. Mary, knowledge lived with Miss Hartnell. She found her old friend in the drawing-room of a well-kept cottage, busily clipping recipes from a stack of faded magazines. "Oh, Jane, you've come just in time. I'm trying to decide between apricot syllabub or the pineapple fool for the harvest luncheon. What do you think?" "Both sound dreadful," Miss Marple said warmly. "But that's never stopped the vicar from pretending to enjoy them." Miss Hartnell laughed. "True enough." Came, Miss Marple continued gently to ask about Leonard Reed. Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. "A broody young man. Not the sort I'd want reading scripture to my grandchildren. But Edith always said he was earnest, and the bishop sponsored him for theological college. Bit of a rough background, though. Orphaned young, raised by an aunt in Cornwall. Came to Lydney St. Mary 5 years ago as a gardener's apprentice. Would you believe it? Quite the rise. But I never liked how he looked at people as though deciding whether they were worth the trouble. And was he close to anyone in the village?" Miss Hartnell considered. "Only to that new widow, I think." What's her name? Miss Elspeth Kane. Moved here from London last year. Quiet type. Always has gloves on, even in summer. Miss Marple gave a small hum. She knew the name. Elspeth Kane lived on Lavender Row, just 2 cottages from the Lanes. And, a widow of indeterminate means and polite reserve, she rarely attended social gatherings, but was a generous donor to church raffles and known for walking her spaniel precisely at 6 each evening. Was it possible Leonard had confided in her? Or more than that? Miss Marple made a note to visit Miss Kane later that day, but before she could, a new ripple passed through the village. Constable Reeves appeared at her door just after noon, his face flushed from exertion and nerves. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "they've found something. A suitcase, hidden in the gardener's shed behind the vicarage." She blinked. "And it's locked. But inside, through a tear in the lining, we saw a document. Foreign, but with English. Translation, passport page. The man's name, Karl Brenwald. Swiss, apparently. Arrived in England 6 days ago." "And what else?" Reeves lowered his voice. "There's also ... a revolver, unloaded, and a photograph of a much younger Leonard Reed, smiling with Brenwald beside him." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. "I see," she murmured. It explained more than it solved. Leonard had known the man, deeply, perhaps. But why hide the suitcase? Why not come forward? Unless the truth, whatever it was, threatened more than just Leonard's reputation. Perhaps it threatened his entire future, was someone else's. And Miss Marple, standing by the hearth with her lace gloves in one hand, now knew where she must go next, to Miss Kane's cottage on Lavender Row, because gloves in summer were almost always hiding something. Chapter 16. Gloves on Lavender Row. Lavender Row was a quiet little curve of houses at the edge of the village prim, floral and well-suited to names like Primrose Cottage and the Laurels. It was a part of Lydney St. Mary that seemed purpose-built for privacy. People who lived there did not hang laundry at the front or loiter on stoops. They went about their business with the practiced discretion of those who had learned long ago to draw their curtains before dusk. Miss Marple walked there, slowly, not because of her age, though her steps were indeed careful, but because haste clouded perception. She took note of everything: the lack of weeds on Miss Kane's pathway, the polished brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, the faint scent of lavender oil from an open upstairs window. She rang the bell and waited. The door opened precisely 10 seconds later, as if Miss Kane had been standing just inside, watching. "Miss Marple," the younger woman said. "Miss is unexpected." Elspeth Kane was in her late 30s, fashionably pale, with ash blonde hair pulled into a tight chignon. She wore a high-necked blouse and, as usual, thin beige gloves, seasonal for the early spring warmth. "I do apologize," Miss Marple said warmly. "I was out for a walk and thought I might check on you. These last few days have been so unsettling." Miss Kane hesitated, then stepped aside. "Course, please, come in." The sitting room was as Miss Marple expected, tasteful, sparse, and immaculately clean. There were no photographs on the mantel, no books out of place, and not a single thread out of line on the embroidered cushions. This was a room where no one ever forgot to compose themselves. "I hope you don't mind my saying," Miss Marple began, "but you've struck me, Miss Kane, as someone who notices things, and I rather thought you might have noticed something useful about the stranger. I'm not sure I understand." "Oh, you know how village gossip can be. Faces seen, things half remembered. Even the smallest recollection may help. Did you ever see the man before he died?" Miss Kane gave a delicate shake of the head. "No, not to my knowledge. But perhaps you knew Leonard Reed, spoke to him often." Elspeth's expression didn't change, but her fingers twitched ever so slightly on the armrest. "We've spoken," she replied. "In passing." Miss Marple studied her. "Only in passing." Another pause. The faintest breath of hesitation. "We had coffee once or twice. He asked for advice about theological schools." "Course," Miss Marple said with a polite nod. "He's a thoughtful young man, if a bit troubled." Elspeth Kane offered a careful smile. "Yes, I suppose that's accurate." "Would it be fair to say," Miss Marple continued, "that you and he were close?" A beat too long passed before Miss Kane answered. "Not especially. I don't involve myself in village affairs." Miss Marple gave no sign of pressing, though her gaze drifted to the gloves. They were soft kid leather, not work gloves, and there was no logical reason for them indoors. "Forgive my curiosity," she said lightly, "but I've always been fascinated by gloves. Such useful things." "I knew a woman once who wore hers, even to bed. Said they made her hands feel less real, less like hers." Miss Kane blinked. "That sounds odd." "Oh yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But she was quite an odd woman, though not nearly as odd as the one who wore gloves after falling down her garden steps. Dislocated her wrist and bruised the skin terribly. She hid it for weeks. Said it made her look fragile." Miss Kane gave a tight laugh. "Well, some of us bruise easily, Miss Marple. I imagine that's true." There was silence then, long, soft, almost companionable. Outside, a thrush sang briefly before fluttering off the fence. Miss Marple leaned back. "Elspeth, I know Leonard Reed was more than a passing acquaintance. I believe he trusted you. Perhaps still does. But there's something weighing on him, and I think you know what it is." Miss Kane stiffened. Her jaw tensed, then relaxed again. "He was frightened," she said at last. "That man Carlee came here looking for him, not just by chance. He found Leonard first. Or rather, Leonard found him. They met the night before he died. In the lane." Miss Marple nodded, saying nothing. "They had history," Miss Kane went on, almost mechanically. "Something from before Leonard came here. Something, ... Serious. Leonard never told me everything. Just enough to know that Carl had power over him. Power to destroy his reputation, his future." "Did Leonard kill him?" Miss Kane's eyes widened. No, I swear, Leonard wouldn't. He isn't capable. But he did hide the suitcase." She didn't reply. Miss Marple studied her gloved hands, folded now in her lap like paper birds. "Miss Kane," she said gently, "may I see your left hand?" Elspeth froze. "Why, you're not wearing the gloves to be fashionable. You're wearing them to hide an injury. You've winced 3 times since I entered the room. Once lifting the teapot, once adjusting your sleeve, and once when you picked up your napkin." The room was silent. Elspeth slowly peeled the glove from her left hand. Bruises, fresh ones, circling the wrist like a cuff. Discoloration up the thumb. Defensive bruises. "I found him," she whispered, "after Leonard had run. I don't know why I think he panicked. Saw Carl's body in the garden. I tried to help him, but he was already dead. And the bruises. I slipped on the flagstone," she said. "Fell on my wrist trying to drag him away from the path. I didn't want the police to think Leonard did it. I didn't want him ruined." Miss Marple reached across and took her hand, gentle as a leaf landing on water. "Thank you, my dear. That mustn't have been easy." "I didn't kill him," Elspeth said again. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "No," she said softly. "But I think I've just realized who did." Chapter 17. Tea at the vicarage, and an omission Miss Marple did not rush. She left Lavender Row with the same calm steps she had taken upon arrival, though her mind was anything but quiet. The bruise on Elspeth Kane's wrist had told her much, but, more importantly, so had the things the young woman had not said. The scene was becoming clearer now. though the figure at its center remained just beyond reach by the time the church bells rang for. Miss Marple was seated once again in the vicarage parlor, sipping tea with Edith's upwater and pretending to admire a particularly poor arrangement of dried flowers. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you've been under such strain. All this attention, the terrible invasion of your garden. Have you been sleeping?" "Hardly," Edith replied, her eyes shadowed. "Every creak makes me jump. Can poor Lionel he tries to carry on, but it's obvious he's shaken. The bishops even mentioned a temporary retreat. Just until things quiet down." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod, her gaze wandering to the framed photo on the mantel of black and white image of the vicar and his wife on their wedding day. Beside it, slightly obscured, was a newer frame, Leonard Reed with a group of Sunday school children, one arm raised in gesture, the other bent strangely at the elbow, as if something had been edited out of the pose. "Edith," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "may I ask a small, possibly silly question? The morning the man appeared, the stranger, do you remember if Leonard was at the vicarage before or after the visit?" Edith blinked. "After. He came in, perhaps 15 minutes later. Said he'd overslept." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just tidying up details. I find the order of things matters very much, don't you?" The vicar's study door opened then, and Reverend Upwater entered, his expression wary. He nodded to Miss Marple and sat beside his wife, smoothing his trousers. "Is there any progress?" he asked. "It's so unspeakably awkward to host death and scandal on sacred ground." "I believe there has been progress. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. "But I think much of it has not yet been recognized for what it is." Reverend Upwater looked puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "It's all very odd, you know," Miss Marple continued, her tone light, cupped, "that a man should appear in the garden and then die there so quietly, so quickly, and with no apparent reason." Cupped. No struggle was heard. Cupped. Just ... silence. "Don't you find that strange?" The vicar cleared his throat. "I assumed, perhaps wrongly, that the man was attacked elsewhere and dragged into the garden." "Dragged," Miss Marple repeated. "Yet no trail of blood, no disturbed soil, and only one glove on the body. The other, found beneath a holly bush, curled like a fallen leaf." Edith's eyes widened. Miss Marple turned to her. "You wouldn't, dear. The constable only noticed it yesterday. You see, if a man falls forward while struggling, it's unusual for his glove to come off entirely unless someone pulled it, or unless it was already removed." Reverend Upwater looked uncomfortable. "I don't quite understand what you're implying." "Only that the man was most likely facing someone he trusted or at least recognized. No signs of robbery. But perhaps a confrontation. A moment of pause." Miss Marple stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the garden stretched quietly, the holly bush now trimmed and neat again. The statue of the fox had been righted. "I once knew a curate," she said, "who led a double life in Belgium. Seemed charming, spoke perfect French, but he embezzled money from his parish to pay off a scandal and affair from before the war. He was discovered when a letter surfaced from a Carl B. in Lausanne." The silence in the room thickened. Miss Marple turned. "Leonard Reed had a past. We all do. But the question isn't what he was. It's what Carl Brenwald came to do. Not to blackmail, no. I believe he came to help." The photograph of the two of them together, a kind gesture, a reminder, and the gun in the suitcase loaded, was for protection, not aggression. The vicar's hands tightened over his knees. "Miss Marple, if you're suggesting, I'm suggesting," she said gently. Said someone else intercepted Carl before he could speak with Leonard. Someone who overheard enough to feel threatened. Someone with a great deal to lose if Leonard's past became public knowledge. After all, theological colleges don't take kindly to scandal, especially those sponsored by respected figures. T gave a sharp breath. You can't mean Lionel. Miss Marple looked at the vicar. The bishop, you said, has been considering your elevation. An archdeaconry, perhaps. But how would it look if your protege, your personal project was tied to a man like Brenwald? What if it raised questions about your own judgment? The room was very still. Reverend Upwater's mouth opened, then closed. Looked toward the fire grate. I didn't mean to kill him, he said finally. I asked to meet him just to speak, to understand how much he knew. He recognized me, I think. He said something like, "You're the one who sent the letters." I panicked. Edith's hands flew to her mouth. Lionel. I thought if I scared him off, sent him away, but he got angry, grabbed my wrist. The spade was beside the holly bush. It was only a moment, just one. Miss Marple said nothing for several seconds. Then she walked to the side table and poured another cup of tea. I believe, she said quietly, you should write your resignation to the bishop and tell Inspector Bullfinch everything. Will he arrest me? Vigar asked in a small voice. Miss Marple looked at him, her expression unreadable. That depends, she said, on whether he believes you killed out of fear or out of malice. She left the vicarage. A moment later, the mist having lifted and the sun just beginning to return, the garden gate creaked closed behind her. Chapter 18. The Bishop's Letter. By Saturday morning, the air in Lydney St. Mary had turned brisk and oddly expectant, like the breath held before the final line of a hymn. The mist had vanished completely, leaving the lane sharp and visible beneath the bright sun. But within the quiet walls of the vicarage, clouds remained. Inspector Bullfinch arrived before 10, summoned not by telephone, but by a brief, handwritten note slipped under the station door composed in the careful, looping script of Reverend Lionel Upwater, Miss Marple. Having taken the liberty of arranging the inspector's breakfast at the village tea room, was already seated, with her cup of Darjeeling and a warm currant bun, when the man himself entered, coat flapping, boots still dusty from the garden path. Well then, Bullfinch said, lowering himself heavily onto the bench opposite her. I take it you've come to hear what I've heard. She smiled politely. Only if you wish to tell me. He glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers, and lowered his voice. The vicar confessed. Said he struck the fellow during a confrontation, claims it wasn't premeditated. The coroner will want to examine the angle of the wound, of course, but it's plausible, said the man lunged. Old story. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And you believe him? Bullfinch scratched his chin. I believe he's afraid, but I also believe there's more. You think so too, don't you? Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps what interests me most is that he used the word panic, and that he claimed to have acted alone. But one doesn't hide a suitcase after an act of panic. One doesn't carry it from the lane, unlock a shed, and cover it behind crates unless one has help. The inspector grunted. Miss Kane. She admitted to finding the body after Leonard ran away. I believe her, but the suitcase was hidden well before that. And Leonard, frightened, confused, wouldn't have thought of such details. Bullfinch exhaled. You believe the vicar had planned something? Believe, said Miss Marple. That Reverend Upwater knew Carl Brenwald's visit posed a danger not merely to Leonard Reed's future, but to his own. And you think he lured him there? Miss Marple picked up her bun, then paused. I think he wrote the man some weeks earlier. A letter, perhaps in Leonard's name, urging him to come. He likely intercepted Carl before Leonard knew he'd arrived. He must have meant only to persuade him to leave quietly. But Carl recognized him. Things escalated. Bullfinch leaned back. That makes Upwater's story more calculated than he's admitted. Still, if it's true, Carl had no legal status here. Oh, I'm sure it will all be managed discreetly, Miss Marple said. But that still leaves one piece unresolved. Which? She set down her teacup. The bishop. Atish. blinked. What does he have to do with it? Quite a lot, I think. At that moment, a telegram boy burst into the tea room. He scanned the tables until his eyes landed on Miss Marple. For you, Miss, special delivery. She unfolded the paper. From Bishop C. Mortimer to Miss Jane Marple, Lightning, St. Mary, deeply disturbed by Reverend Upwater's confession. Had no knowledge of correspondence with Swiss National. Please meet me at Vicarage noon. Miss Marple handed the slip across the table. Bullfinch read it, then frowned. So the bishop denies involvement. Course he does, she replied. But the letter Carl received must have appeared official enough to prompt travel. And Carl wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have come all the way from Zurich for a vague summons. It must have been carefully written and forged, Bullfinch said, nodding. Perhaps with church letterhead. Precisely. At noon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, where the bishop had just concluded his private meeting with the Reverend. The clergyman's face was ashen. His resignation already signed. Bishop Mortimer, a tall man with severe eyebrows and a soft voice, greeted her in the drawing room. Miss Marple, he said, offering his hand, I must confess, had no idea of the depth of what has transpired here. Known Lionel for 20 years. This is ... unthinkable. It's tragic, Miss Marple agreed, but not, I'm afraid, entirely unpredictable. The bishop's brow furrowed. What do you mean? She glanced at the hearth, where Edith Upwater sat silently knitting. There was ambition, Miss Marple said softly, a great deal of it, bound up with appearances. I think Reverend Upwater saw Leonard read as his projecta brilliant redemption story from orphan to clergyman. But such narratives are delicate. A single foreign acquaintance, a whisper of scandal, and the whole structure collapses. The bishop's lips pressed into a tight line. He should have told me. He was ashamed, Miss Marple replied. But more than that, I believe he felt cornered. Once Carl arrived, he realized there was no going back. The lie had grown too large. The bishop exhaled. And now the lie has ruined them all. Miss Marple gave a faint nod. Not all. Cleanart is young. If the full truth is known as part in it, minimal, confused I believe he may yet find a different path. And Elspeth came. A woman of strong nerves and loyal instincts, Miss Marple said. She weathered the storm. As for the rest of the village, well, gossip will flare for a week or two, and then it will all be stitched back into the fabric of memory, quietly, politely forgotten. She stood, smoothing her gloves. But I do hope, Bishop, that in your next appointment, you encourage your clergy to value honesty above reputation. It saves a great deal of gardening. The bishop smiled, despite himself. You've a gift, Miss Marple. She tilted her head. No, my lord, merely a habit of listening. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the first lilacs were beginning to bloom along the lane, their scent soft and steady in the breeze. A bird called from the church tower. The gate to the vicarage clicked gently behind her, and Miss Marple, with a satisfied sigh, made her way home to her teapot and her knitting, where she could once more turn her attention to the more predictable threads of woolen human nature. Chapter 19. Truths best left in the garden, despite the murder, despite the suitcase and resignation, despite the uncomfortable brush with scandal. Lightning St. Mary resumed its rhythms with almost suspicious ease. By Monday, the bakery's butter shortage was the most discussed tragedy, and the post office queue had returned to its usual muttered complaints about parcel delays and the price of international stamps. But beneath the surface of every polite nod and warm handshake, something had shifted. Miss Marple felt it, not in words, but in silence's longer pauses, before greetings, shorter eye contact, and that peculiar hush that descends whenever a certain subject threatens to rise. She was in the back garden of her cottage that morning, carefully deadheading the dahlias, when she was visited by Leonard Reed. He arrived awkwardly, hands deep in his coat pockets, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. It was the first time he had come to her directly since Carl Brenwald's death. "Miss Marple, okay?" She looked up. "Mr. Reed, come sit. The morning sun is rather forgiving." Kay hesitated, then sat on the stone bench near the gooseberry bush. "I wanted to thank you," he began. "That's kind," she said, "though I've done very little." "You've done everything. If you hadn't spoken to ELSPETH... If you hadn't understood before the police did, I don't know where I'd be now." She smiled, not unkindly. "Sometimes understanding isn't about solving. It's about allowing people the space to tell the truth." He nodded. "I never meant for any of this. Carl, he wasn't a threat. He'd come to make peace. I think he was doing well in Zurich, said he'd found work, stability. He wanted to see if I needed help, but Reverend Upwater believed otherwise." Leonard's jaw tightened. "He overheard me talking about Carl once, months ago, after a late supper. I didn't say much, just that we'd been close, that we'd known each other before I turned to faith. He didn't say anything at the time, but he changed toward me, subtly. Less trust, fewer responsibilities." Miss Marple poured him a glass of lemonade from a tray nearby. "When Carl came," she said, "you were afraid." "Yes, not of him, of everything else. Okay, that someone might think I'd lied to get where I was. Okay, that I'd deceived the church. And truthfully, I had. Not in facts, but in omission." Miss Marple considered this. "Omission," she said softly, "can be a type of protection, but when used by others, it can become a weapon." He looked away. "He asked me to leave quietly. The vicar, he said if I had any respect for my future, I'd walk away. I think he planned to meet Carl afterward. Perhaps he thought he could pay him off, or frighten him. I don't think he expected a confrontation." Miss Marple's eyes were distant. Men rarely do. They assume the world can be put right with a stern word and a tidy solution. Leonard rubbed his hands together. "I didn't go far. I watched from the trees. When I saw Carl fall, I couldn't process it. I didn't go to him. I ran, like a coward. Like a young man overwhelmed by something too large to carry alone," Miss Marple said gently. "There is a difference." He glanced at her. "Do you think I should leave Lydney?" Miss Marple paused. "That," she said slowly, "depends on whether you wish to continue being someone else or if you're ready to become yourself. Now that the past no longer chases you." Leonard Reed sat in silence. Then, with a quiet breath, he stood. "Thank you," he said again, "for seeing me when I wasn't sure who I was anymore." She watched him walk down the garden path, shoulders straighter, steps heavier, but no longer directionless. Later that day, she took her usual seat at the window overlooking the green. The news of the vicar's formal resignation had now made. The morning messenger tucked discreetly between news of a rare meteor shower and the recipe column. Miss Marple noted that the article referred to a health-related leave, and she allowed that discretion had, perhaps, been wisely chosen. Across the road, Elspeth Kane passed by on her walk, spaniel at her side. She wore no gloves, just a soft linen jacket, her bruised hand held plainly by the leash. She caught sight of Miss Marple. The older woman gave her a small nod. Elspeth returned it. Some truths, Miss Marple thought, need only be acknowledged once. That evening, at the parish council meeting, there were no references to the murder or the resignation. Instead, a discussion unfolded about repairing the vestry roof, placing the hymnals, and possibly inviting a new choirmaster from East Davington. Marple spoke only once, to suggest lavender under the west windows to deter the bees. Proposal passed unanimously. As the meeting drew to a close, Constable Reeves lingered by the tea table. "So it's finished, then?" Miss Marple looked up from her biscuit. "No, my dear, it's simply settled. He frowned. What's the difference? She smiled. A settled story may not have all the facts, but it has found its place in people's minds. That's all justice really is. Sometimes, okay? A kind of peace, even if imperfect. He chewed on that. Still, he muttered, odd place to die. In a garden with holly and fox statues. Miss Marple nodded. Gardens reveal more than we expect. Things grow there, and not just plants. Secrets, guilt, and occasionally truth. She folded her napkin and rose, and as she walked home beneath the faint stars and the soft smell of damp grass, the village once more felt like itself, quiet, contained, and watchful, as it always had been. There is a time for sowing and a time for reaping, he'd said, but never a time for hiding what we've grown. And she supposed that, in the end, this was the lesson of the stranger at the vicar's gate, that no secret, however carefully tended, can remain planted forever. Eventually, something always grows, and someone, somewhere, always notices when it blooms. Chapter 20. The quiet beneath the ivy. 2 weeks had passed since the affair in the vicarage garden had been laid to rest, and already the village had done what villages do, best folded the memory into its patchwork of cautionary tales, whispered conversations, and politely unfinished sentences. The holly bush had grown a little, and the small stone fox statue now wore a modest veil of ivy, as if modesty itself had crept into the soil. Miss Marple was in her sitting room. One breezy afternoon, when she received a letter, creamy paper, ink slightly smudged, was from Elspeth Kane. Dear Miss Marple, Leonard has accepted a position at a school in Devon, not in the church, at least not for now. He says he wants to learn how to be honest before he ever tries to lead others again. I told him it was the first sensible thing he's said in months. I'm staying in Slidney, St. Mary. I think I've spent enough of my life running. I wanted you to know that I'm well, and that I haven't forgotten what you did for both of us. Yours sincerely, Elspeth Kane. Miss Marple set the letter down with a quiet exhale. Outside, the postman tipped his cap to a robin. Later that day, Inspector Bullfinch came for tea. He arrived stiffly, as always, but brought with him a small parcel of cinnamon biscuits from his sister in Much Biddleton, which Miss Marple accepted with warm gratitude. So, it's done, he said, sipping tea by the fireplace. The bishop's office confirmed Upwater's resignation. The church, unsurprisingly, declined to press charges. They've called it a moral failing. Very ecclesiastical way of putting it. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Moral failings are often much harder to prosecute than criminal ones. The inspector frowned. There's still something that doesn't sit quite right. Oh, I understand why Upwater panicked. I even understand the attempted cover-up. But what I don't understand is why the glove. Miss Marple looked at him gently. It was not Upwater who removed the glove. Bullfinch's brow furrowed. What? Think of the scene. Carl Brennwald, lying face down, one glove missing, no defensive wounds, no blood on Leonard's hands, and, most importantly, no struggle witnessed by anyone nearby, despite the garden being so central. She poured herself more tea. Upwater didn't lure Carl there to scare him. He lured him to listen to, see if Carl might be persuaded to keep Leonard's past a secret. Okay? But the moment turned. Carl likely said something, perhaps threatened to expose Upwater's letters or his manipulation of church sponsorship. Something that felt too risky. And then Upwater killed him. No, Miss Marple said simply. Upwater confronted Carl. They argued, and someone overheard it. Someone who had more to lose than even the Reverend. Finch stared. Elspeth Kane, Miss Marple said, her voice a whisper over porcelain. She was not just Leonard's confidant. She had a relationship with Carl once, brief, distant, but meaningful, before he ever knew Leonard, before the war. A chance meeting in Zurich during her student days. She realized who he was, the man from Leonard's past. She must have felt her world narrowing. She told me she found the body after Leonard fled. She lied, Miss Marple said gently. She didn't find it. She created it. She was in the garden already, perhaps following Leonard, perhaps out for air. She saw the confrontation, and she saw an opportunity. Bullfinch leaned forward. But the bruises on her wrist, she said. She fell, said Miss Marple, but not trying to help the man. Trying to drag him deeper into the hedge, to make it look like he had been surprised. She removed his glove, to suggest a struggle, to confuse the timeline. She killed him. No, Miss Marple said softly, but she ensured that death became a murder. She turned panic into deception. And that, Inspector, is what buried the truth deeper than any spade. Bullfinch rubbed his chin. You have no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed. But she will not leave the village. She will tend her roses. She will walk her spaniel. She will do penance in the only way that makes sense to her. And that, too, is a kind of justice. They sat in silence for a while. Then the inspector stood, offered her his hand, and gave a rare, quiet nod of respect. Outside, dusk fell over Lydney St. Mary, laying down shadows like folded linen. The vicarage gate no longer squeaked. The holly bush had been trimmed. A new curate had been appointed, younger, cheerful, and unburdened by scandal, and Miss Marple, seated by her lice-draped window, resumed her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steadily, as the village turned another page in its long, curious book of secrets. And in the heart of the garden, beneath the ivy and the silence, the truth slept gently, no longer dangerous, only remembered. Epilogue. The garden remembers spring deepened in Lydney St. Mary. The skies turned a warmer blue, and lambs appeared in the fields beyond the hedgerows. The village seemed to stretch its limbs after a long winter night, the one of weather, of silence and scandal, murmured regrets, and a slow recalibration of reputations. It was on a Thursday morning, nearly a month after the events at the vicarage, that Miss Marple found herself once again walking along the side path that led past the garden's edge. The holly bush, site of so much recent speculation, had begun to sprout tender new leaves, green and soft, as though unaware of the grim memory tied to its roots. She paused there, not out of morbidity, but out of something more contemplative. Time had passed, and with it, the worst of the gossip had faded. Yet the earth never truly forgets. Not murder, not guilt, not human frailty. Edith Upwater had left the vicarage quietly a week after her husband's resignation. She went to stay with a cousin in the Cotswolds, citing the need for spiritual recuperation. No one questioned it. No one needed to. There had been no formal farewell, no church tea in her honor. Only a bouquet left by Miss Hartnell on the doorstep and a note that read, "You are always kind to the CHOIRBOYS. Reverend Lionel Upwater's future was less certain." The church had accepted his resignation without scandal, the matter framed publicly as exhaustion and ill health. Privately, Miss Marple had heard from Bishop Mortimer himself that Upwater was being relocated to a small retreat in the north, where he would serve in solitude and contemplation, a gentler exile. Miss Marple did not think ill of him. His weakness came in many forms, and though he had committed no direct murder, his fear had steered the course of more than one life. For that, he would have a long time to reflect. Leonard Reed had indeed taken a teaching position in Devon. He sent postcards to Elspeth Kang at first, then began to write longer letters, more personal, more candid. In one, which Elspeth had shared over tea, he wrote, "I think the greatest punishment for me is realizing I wasn't honest with myself. The faith I claimed was borrowed. I am trying to find one of my own, not given by mentors, not taken from regret, but something that grows like a thing planted in proper soil." Miss Marple found that metaphor pleasing. Elspeth Kane had not left lightly, though many expected she would. She remained in her cottage on Lavender Row, and though she no longer wore gloves, she remained the same in many ways, precise, independent, and observant. But there was a slight change in her manner, now a softening of the voice, a longer pause, before speaking, as though she were measuring not just her words, but her place in the world. One afternoon, as they sat in Miss Marple's garden, sipping nettle tea, Elspeth remarked, "I sometimes wonder what might have happened had Carl lived, had he stayed, spoken." Miss Marple had regarded her evenly. "I think he would have forgiven." Elspeth looked down. "That's what terrifies me." It was not a confession, not directly, but it was enough. The village itself, as always, healed through rhythm. The spring fete had been announced with the usual bunting, and Mrs. Price Riley was already assembling volunteers for the sponge cake competition. The parish council had installed new benches outside the church, and no one mentioned why one of the old ones had been quietly removed and burned. And though no one said it aloud, there was an unspoken agreement that some questions like where Carl Brenwald had spent the night before his death would remain unanswered. Inspector Bullfinch returned to Much Biddleton, mildly irritated that no formal charges had been laid, but secretly relieved to have escaped the village's suffocating politeness. Constable Reeves continued to make his rounds, often slower now, more thoughtful. He had taken 2 jotting notes about unusual behavior, which he never submitted just for himself, he said, but to practice seeing what Miss Marple sees. As for Miss Marple herself, she resumed her usual quiet routine in the garden, Thursdays at the library, and evenings by the fire with her needles and wool. Yet something in her had shifted too, not her clarity or sense of justice, her understanding of how deep even the quietest souls could bury their secrets. She reflected often on the truth of the matter. The murder had been sudden, yes, but the motive had grown slowly like ivy over stone. Not just fear, not just ambition, Tony, but the desperate human need to control how others see us, to manage memory before it is made. Carl Brenwald had threatened no one, not really, but his presence had reminded everyone that the past was never quite buried, and in a village that thrived on presentation, on clean garden paths and trimmed hedges, there was little room for messier truths. Miss Marple stood once more by the garden gate, now painted a new shade of green. She watched the children from the school run by, laughing, untethered by the weight of things buried. She remembered a verse, something her father had once said after a funeral when she was still a girl.